Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
I'm calling it Black Vein Blues. It makes sense if you think about it. About a month ago, it started, slow and quiet. I had just come home from school to find my father prodding at the corpse of a gator that washed up on the bank a couple of paces from our home. At that time, I'd been furious, thinking his redneck ass had killed it even in spite of the numerous charges he'd get slapped with for killing a protected species. It was only when I approached it did I realize just how bad it was. The thing was bloated and pale, with ink-black webbing sprouting just under the skin. My father had been prodding it with the tail end of a fire poker, so the belly of it had opened and spilled onto the ground. Its guts, a grease-black spill on the deadened grass. I remember retching at the sight and smell, turning away and cursing out loud for my father to get the fuck away from it. He hadn't been too happy to hear his own spawn yelling at him like he was a simple fool. So I ended up being charged with cleaning the thing off our property, but only after he skinned it to sell the leather once he finished up. He never got to sell it. He didn't last that long. Later that evening, after a long shower, I'd gone up to the store to buy some things for dinner. Nothing big or costly, so it only took me a half hour to get the shit and hike back. I remember the store had been eerily silent. All of the other customers lost in some sort of daze. Some didn't even notice when I knocked directly into them, their glassy eyes flying to me and then back to whatever they were focused on. I wrote it up for being a sign of the times, what with the pre-existing illness racking the land long before this one ever touched our lands. The cashier had just been about the only person with half of their wits, but only enough to warn me to look out for sick people on my way back to the house. Little did I know I would find out just what she meant the moment I entered my driveway. There my father was, stood in the center of the road completely nude and coated in inky black blood. It was like something out of a horror movie. His eyes had reflected in the shine of the headlights, already dead focused. "Dad, what the fuck is wrong with you?" I had asked. Throwing open the car door and stepping, something stopped me then. Self-preservation, probably. An instinct buried within my mind that warned me not to go near the man drooling ropes of blood and mucus. It was a good thing, too, because when he let out that animal shriek and lunged for me, I had enough time to get right back into the car and slam the door behind me before he hit the metal behind me. He was so maddened that he slammed his face over and over into the window, not 5 inches from my face, blurring the glass with the blackened blood. I was so petrified. I didn't even think for a minute, just staring at that thing that had once been my father as it gored itself against the windows of our old truck. My call to the cops had been frantic, and I almost thought they might not believe me until the operator let me know someone would be coming up to check the property in the next couple of minutes. I wanted to scream at them to hurry, but I simply shut my eyes and I prayed the windows held up. Then, as if it knew what I had done, it just stopped. I could see its white milky eyes through the haze on my windows, watching me intently. It was the closest I'd ever been able to observe one of them. I saw what the disease did to their body, bleeding through their skin and veins, until it looked like they were coated with blackened cobwebs. They no longer had pupils or eye color, really replaced by bluish milk-white circles that shot from side to side as their blind gazes sought out who knows what in the dark. He was so still and calm that for a second I had thought he might have come to, but then its broken jaw opened wide enough to hit its chest, and it let out a shriek that pierced the night and shook the entire car before it turned and sped into the wild. I hadn't seen him since. Not in the trees, not in the town. It was as if he had disappeared off the face of the earth. The cops had arrived an hour later, but he was already gone. And so they left with a shake of their head, muttering about crazed teenagers. I wonder if they knew what they were going to be walking right back into when they got home later that night. My father hadn't been the only one affected, leading me to believe that it wasn't the gator that turned him mad. In 24 hours, the town had gone from normal to complete chaos. The disease had taken over, turning a good portion of our population into drooling monsters. It attacks your mind first, is what I think happens. Your brain overheats, scrambling like eggs in a hot skillet and leaving behind something mindless and violent. Not quite like turning into a zombie, but close enough to where some of the townsfolk went by those old rules. Any bites, and you get a bullet to the head. I witnessed that myself on day 3. Just when I had been brave enough to venture out into the silence. Needless to say, I stopped traveling out in the open after that. From what little I could gather, the town went completely nuts. The sane people turned right into something out of an atypical apocalypse movie, where the people went right into savage mode in order to keep order. Law enforcement had been quick to interfere, but only enough to establish themselves as kings of the castle and wall off any resources the rest of the townsfolk may need. From what I had heard from the one actually sane person I'd met, that they had put away some of the people affected with black vein in the jail cells to experiment with. I shuddered at the thought of what that might mean. Still, that wasn't the worst of it. You know that phrase, the one popularized by modern movies and media? What if humans were the real bad guy? God, they were so wrong. Nothing could compare to what those things were doing. You see, the difference between them and zombies is that they still are entirely human, or at least think like them. Even as they turn into slobbering, rage-infested creatures, they still have the presence of mind to hunt. I'm lucky enough to have witnessed it before I got caught into one of their traps. In the middle of the night, one day I had decided to use the darkness in order to head into town, to grab whatever supplies I could loot from unguarded businesses. Just as I had reached town, I saw them gathered in the middle of the road, looking up at something strung to a streetlight. There were people caught in one of those hunter nets meant to trap large game. Their wails of terror had filled the night as the 3 of them had been slowly lowered to the ground and promptly ripped to shreds at the hands of those monsters. They had taken their time, seeming to bask in the horror and degradation as they killed them one by one. I couldn't look away. Something within me refused to believe it was even real. I had seen terrible shit on TV before. But watching your neighbors laugh and shout in delight as they remove the organs of people you once shopped side by side with was a whole new ballgame. It didn't stop there. The evidence of their rampages was more and more apparent as you snuck down the streets. There were stores that had been burnt to the ground, others splattered with blood and gore. There were clear stains on the street where you could see victims had tried to flee before being dragged into whatever hell was awaiting them. I didn't even make it to the store before I turned and ran all the way back to my house. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw that day. Nothing could erase the memory of those horrific things I'd witnessed or the shit I would continue to see every time I gathered the courage to leave my home. I'm stuck. Utterly stuck in my decaying cabin. I can't trust the water anymore because I'm almost 100% sure where it came from. It would be the only explanation for the gator washing up with the disease a day before it affected our first townfolk. I have enough food to last for a while, but it's not food I'm worried about. It's the water. Even with my stockpile, I'll only last the next month or so. I know what some of you are going to say. Get the fuck out of there. Take your truck and speed right out of town limits before you're claimed too. It's too late for that. I saw the trucks arrive not hours ago. The barrier set up in record time. Anyone brave enough to go near them gets snatched up by the men in yellow, or shot right between the eyes. I know well enough about our government to know those who got taken won't end up well and safe on the other side. I beg of you, if you have any information I could use to help myself out in this situation, please tell me. I'm running out of options here, and I don't know how far this has gone. I suppose some of you are going to be disappointed with me. After all, there's no good end to this story. I wish I could tell you everything turned out fine in the end and I used all those survival tips to flee into the woods, but I hardly had enough time to read them before the end had already begun. Things had gone south since I last posted, and I, like the disease, it happened fast. It was like something sparked in the air, catching all at once and starting the blaze that would end it all. It was rain. A storm so thick you'd end up soaked just by looking at it. I knew it was the end, even before it wet the very earth on which I stood. There is something I should admit. I'm not entirely immune, as some of you might have thought. I just haven't been claimed by the rage the others seem to have fallen victim to. My veins went black, but my head remained the same, a cool 98 degrees on the thermometer. I thought for a moment, even with the sickness taking root in every corner of my body, that I might somehow be fine, that I was just not affected like the others. But then there was the pull. It had seated itself right on the back of my brain, whispering to my consciousness with every hour that went past. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the impact they had on my mind as each time I felt the caress of its shadowed touch. I'd find myself leaving my own mind for a split second. Sometimes it was so strong, I'd find myself opening my eyes what seemed like a split second after last closing them, standing in the water right outside my house, staring empty down into its inky depths. It was part of the reason why I hadn't joined up with any of the other survivors. Well, that, and there was no way I was going to trust them when half of them were willing to put a bullet in an innocent, if there was even the slight amount of question about their behavior. I didn't even want to think about what might happen. If I had the guts to approach one of those men in yellow, stealing people right off the streets. They never took the survivors. They weren't here to rescue us or to try and help us survive. Within our town's quarantine, they stole the infected, and they shot anyone who thought might interfere. Perhaps it was luck, or just some sort of twisted fate. But I had seen them in action, speeding into town in their armored little vans, and grabbing the infected one by one. One of the ones they had taken had been the cashier from day one. I almost wanted to laugh. "Look out for the sick," she had said. Famous last words. As much as I wanted to, I knew the best option for me was to remain hidden until something drastically changed and I was forced to relocate. Unfortunately for us all, that something was the rain. Something drew me out of the house that day. That voice in my mind calling me to come into the open and see what it had in store for me. I didn't think of my safety, nor much of anything else. It was a mindless gut feeling that had me putting one foot in front of the other, until I was standing right in front of the section of town that had housed the rest of the survivors. Most of them had made their homes in the town hall, the only stone and brick building in the next 10 miles that could potentially protect them from a threat like this. It had been a smart idea. Being as it's not easy to burn down a brick building, made it even smarter with the obvious defenses they had set up. Though it hadn't been enough if my being brought there meant anything. The doors were wide open. Tables and barriers spilled out its large entryway. Blood oozed out of the building, its impossibly bright red color making still fresh stains on the pristine white steps. I didn't want to go in. I didn't want to see, but whatever burned in my skull didn't care about my wants. It dragged me step by step into the building until I stood right in the center of the storm, right in the center of the screams. They were everywhere, on the walls, in the rafters. Hundreds of infected sat laughing around the ring in the center of the room, where the blood ran thickest. It was a bone-chilling laughter, one of pure madness and glee. There was only one survivor left. A man, unfamiliar to me, lay on the center of the floor. I won't describe what they had done to him, for I would rather not inflict that terrible knowledge on anyone else. I will say, though, that there was no way the man should have been alive. Not with as little of him as there was left. Still he was, eyes wide and mouth open in an endless silent scream. The blood in his mouth muted anything he might have been trying to say, but I doubted he could have done anything other than to beg for mercy at that moment. I was almost sick. Almost. If what I saw hadn't numbed me, I might have fallen to my knees and retched my guts out. But I was already long past that. I only watched, feeling nothing but numbness and pity as my ears began to burn. For some reason, they did not attack me. Maybe because they sensed the illness that had already consumed my body. Maybe they were so distracted with the show, they didn't care. Either way, it wasn't a blessing. I would have preferred death over watching them make playthings of the bodies of the last strugglers left of the town's survivors. I don't know how long I kept going through the downpour, until I found myself staring down one of the couple exit roads our town has. It was one of the places where the barricades had been set up. This one larger and made mostly for the purpose of keeping the diseased in and those fortunate enough not to be caught in the massacre out. Only when I got there, it was completely void of any meaningful life. No men in yellow, no military guards, not a single sign of life. That is, apart from the black veins. I can see them standing there, completely still, as if they all were listening for any movement. Only one acknowledged my arrival, its blind white eyes snapping up to me. It remained like that, completely still as it monitored my movements. All of the black veins I've seen as of late had been doing exactly that. Standing still, listening, hunting. How many poor uninfected souls had fallen victim to them, I wondered. How was it I hadn't? I had a million questions, all burning like a hot iron through my quickly overheating mind. As much as I wondered, I knew the answer. I felt the answer burning bright right behind my eyes. I don't know if this has spread, or how I made it this long, but it hardly matters. It's over now. Time is ticking for me. This I know. I already see my veins in my arms darkening even further with the illness. I feel my very humanity peeling away like layers from an onion. Soon, there will be little left of me but the vessel that is my body. I couldn't take the injustice of it all. I didn't do anything to deserve this. I stayed in the shadows. I didn't talk to anyone. I followed the rules and did as my father asked, and I never got into trouble. I was a good kid. So why is my mind filling with those sickening thoughts? I see him now as I sit at my computer chronicling what I know is the final moments of my sanity. He's standing out in the woods, completely still as he looks directly through my window, right to where I sit. It's as if he knows what's come over me. Maybe he knew from the start, and he's just been waiting this whole time for me to realize it too. One thing I did think was weird that I thought you should know before I log off for good was that he wasn't alone. None of them were. They had never been. Look out for the shadows. That's where they go to hide.
Still Waters from the Claverhouse emails. Performed here by Jason Hill. They say that your life flashes before your eyes before you die. Well, mine didn't. At least not literally. But maybe suicide doesn't count. All I remember going through my head as I stood on the parapet of the bridge and gazed down into the inky black waters beneath was a deep sense of resignation. I'd been over and over everything in my head thousands of times already. All that was left was just that one little step. Just to put one foot in front of the other. Kinda like I'd been doing my entire life. The cold night air felt fresh and cool against my face, like the farewell kiss of a long-lost love. I closed my eyes, raised a foot into the empty air in front of me. That's when it happened. I hesitated. Hesitated just long enough for my life to take a very different turn. A dry, sardonic laugh echoed through the night. A kind of world-weary chuckle that suffocated the seriousness of my intent in an instant. I opened my eyes and turned around. A figure was idling towards me out of the darkness. Nice night for a walk, eh? His tone was breezy and light. I did my best to ignore him, but he walked up and sat himself down on the wall beside me, facing into the bridge. He took out a small pouch and began rolling himself a cigarette. Halfway through the process, he looked at me sideways, his eyes glinting in the orange streetlights. So, how's things? I stared down at him. Just peachy, thanks. He laughed again. Yeah, looks like it. His nimble fingers produced a toothpick-thin cigarette, which he licked and lit with the dexterity of a stage magician. He took a long, deep drag, then exhaled a thick plume of smoke out into the night. The silence stretched out between us like thick toffee. Eventually, I couldn't stand it any longer. Now look, I don't want to talk about it, and you can't do anything to help me, so you might as well leave and just let me get on with it, okay? Fair enough. I've never exactly been a good listener anyways. Right. Good. He took another drag, letting the smoke hang for a moment in the empty air. But how about you do something for me first? Now it was my turn to give a little laugh. For you? Like what? Oh, it's quite simple, really. You just give me a year of your life. A year of my life. Is there an echo out here? You're crazy. Says the guy about to take the shortest swim of his life. What have you got to lose? You've been the master of your life so far, and where has that led you? To this one-off, high-dive performance for an audience of one? He grinned, his eyes twinkling from beneath his shaggy, unkempt hair. You don't want it anymore, so give it to me, for just 1 year. This isn't some kind of sex slave thing or something, is it? A deep chuckle reverberated across the bridge. Oh, no. No, nothing like that. You place your life in my keeping for 12 months. After that, we part company. You can do whatever you please. Your life is your own again. And if you want to come back here, well, that's entirely up to you. He threw his cigarette over his shoulder. I watched it spiral down to the rushing water below. Just 1 year. No time at all, really, considering you'd be a long time dead. But I still think you're insane. Why should I trust you? He grinned. You, my friend, are an excellent judge of character. He reached into his pocket and pulled something out, holding it out to me in his closed fist. Call this your insurance policy. I sat down beside him on the wall of the bridge, legs dangling over the river beneath, and put my outstretched palm under his fist. He opened his hand, and something small but reassuringly heavy dropped into mine. It was a tiny, double-barreled revolver, inlaid in silver with a pearl handle. It looked old, well-worn. It's a Derringer. I'm told it's an antique. I turned it over in my hand. Careful now. It's loaded. Try it. I pointed it down into the water and pulled the trigger. There was a sharp crack, and the tiny weapon jumped in my hand as the bullet splashed into the river. 1 shot left. That's your get-out-of-jail-free card. It'll save you the drive back here if you ever went out of the deal at any time. And if you're worried about me doing you a mischief, well, that's your security right there. You're holding all the aces, friend. So now, what's it gonna be? I felt the weight of the tiny pistol in my hand as I considered this strange suggestion. A brand new life, for a year, free from everything that had driven me here in the first place. It could be like being born again. I had already walked out of my old life. Why not start anew? And it was true. I fucked up royally on my own terms. Why not live my life on someone else's for a while? I turned to the wild-eyed stranger and raised the barrels of the miniature gun squarely to his forehead. He was right. I did have nothing to lose. A wide grin broke across his face, and a twinkle of something light, anticipation, danced in his eyes. I think we have a deal, I said, pocketing the revolver and striding away from the bridge. There's an old Chinese curse I've always liked. It just says, "May you live in interesting times." Well, my life certainly got more interesting from that night on. My mysterious benefactor, if you could call him that, was unlike anyone I'd ever met. He showed me that beneath the surface of things, behind the veneer of humdrum normality that most people work hard to lose themselves in on a day-to-day basis, there's another, deeper world lurking in the cracks and the shadows that is quite unlike anything you've ever experienced. My newfound friend and I traveled to all the secret corners of the world, met people who seemed to straddle the boundaries between what was real and what was other. In those 12 months, we lived every possible kind of life you can imagine. We dallied with the drunks and down-and-outs in the nether realms of New York, rubbed shoulders with the rich and famous on the streets of Monte Carlo, and even lived for a time in a weather-beaten croft in the remote and desolate highlands of Scotland. My companion seemed to know everyone and could open doors into areas that I never even imagined could have existed. He seemed to exist on the margins of reality himself. He was definitely insane, that much was certain, but his insanity was infectious, and he introduced me to countless other strange and unique individuals around the world. It would be too easy to dismiss it all as a kind of madness. The shared covenant of the insane, which my companion inculcated in me while I was in an emotional and vulnerable state. That's the kind of explanation the old me would have put on things, so I could tidy those experiences away in a neat little box and not have to think about them too much. But one of the things I learned, perhaps the most enduring lesson that I'll take with me to my grave, is the fact that perception is reality. Those dark, creeping things that we faced in the moonlight in Sri Lanka, the shape-shifting miasma that we cornered in a back alley of Wall Street, even the nightmarish entity that almost stole away both of our minds in those toilets in that illegal club in Munich. Though they might not seem possible in your world, their existence is as real to me now as the ground beneath my feet. I still bear the scars, physical and mental. Whenever I asked my companion about himself or his life before we met, all he would give me was a tight-lipped little grin. Me? I'm just another pilgrim, he'd say. A fellow traveler. Just like you. Eventually, I stopped asking. In the end, it didn't really matter. I closed the door on my old life the moment I walked off that bridge, and now, everything was a voyage of discovery. There didn't seem any point in looking backwards, not when every day held such challenging and testing new experiences for me. It was all I could do to keep up with him. I felt like a tightrope walker, afraid to stop and look down for fear of falling. I lost track of time as the year wore on. I knew we were balanced precariously on the very edge of reality, between madness and sanity. And I knew that we were playing a very dangerous game. Even as I was exploring these new realms that my companion had opened for me, I think I always knew that things were destined not to end well. You can't play fast and loose with the rules of reality like we did, and not expect it to come back one day and kick you in the face. Eventually, it was the turn of the seasons that reminded me of our deal. The sting of winter was gathering in the air again. The Derringer seemed to weigh more heavily in my pocket than ever. In all that time we'd spent together, it had never left my side. I began to think about what would happen once the year was up. Would we just go our separate ways? Would I be left to fend for myself again? Knowing what I knew, having seen what I'd seen. There was no returning to my old life. That was for sure. Those days already felt like a half-remembered dream. I was suddenly very aware of time passing. My companion seemed to grow more and more distant as the days rolled on. Did he have a plan for when the year was over? Was he hatching another mad scheme with me at the center of it? Or maybe it was just me. Maybe, as the deadline drew closer, I was getting paranoid, and my newly attuned senses were picking up on things that simply weren't there. Still, I began to look on my friend with new eyes. He'd always been secretive by nature, and now I began to read a dark intent into his every move. I'd seen him be callous, even brutal in the way he dealt with people, and I knew how easily he could turn on a whim and throw my world upside down. He was a man of his word, but once our deal was done, there was no telling what he might have in store for me. We returned to my hometown without a word said between us about the looming deadline. The old streets that had once been my home seemed peopled by sinister shadows and malicious whispers that died away before I could catch them. The place was utterly alien to me now, like a cheap stage set full of bad bit-part actors. It gave me a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach to be back there again. My companion appeared to grow more distant with each passing day. He seemed flat and uncommunicative, and my growing fear and suspicion filled his silences with unspoken yet sinister motives. It got so that I could hardly bear to be around him. His very presence began to feel threatening to me, and his unpredictable and eccentric nature, which I had once found so intriguing, and only instilled in me a growing sense of dread. I became convinced that I had to do something, and do it soon, before the year was up. A kind of heavy malignancy seemed to hang in the air, tainting everything it touched. The tension was almost unbearable. We were driving back to the bridge in his van when things finally came to a head. He wouldn't say that that's where we were going, but the streets themselves seemed to lead us there with an eerie inevitability. It was a year to the day since we'd struck our little deal, and as the time ticked on, I grew more uncomfortable by the second. Pull over. My voice sounded thin and wavering against the low growl of the van's ancient engine. He looked over at me with something like resignation in his cold blue eyes. The van slid to a halt in a small alcove in the outskirts of town. And so we come full circle, he muttered under his breath. I took the derringer from my pocket and again pointed it squarely at his forehead. It looked ridiculous in my oversized hand, like a child's toy. But something in my manner must have conveyed the seriousness of my intent. He shut off the engine. "Get out of the van," I said, still without a clue as to what I was going to do next. Without a word, he opened the door and slid out of his seat. I followed, the cold night air washing over me like icy water. We faced each other by the side of the road, the lights of the city twinkling in the background. So, now what? As ever, he seemed entirely unfazed by this new development. I was about to ask you the same question. Well, that was always your problem. Too many questions. By now you should know that you find the answers in the doing of things and not in the asking. What does that even mean? I was getting flustered. He remained cool as a cucumber. Look, I want to know what you've got planned for me, where we go from here. How should I know? You get your life back. What you do with it is entirely up to you. Somehow I doubted that. But how could you do that? Just walk away. After everything we've seen, everything that you've showed me. He shrugged. What were you expecting? Some pot of gold at the end of the rainbow? No, there's no end point. No goal. Things just continue on, and what goes around comes around and around and around and around. Yeah, thanks for that, Yoda. That cleared things up on no end. He gave a tired little half smile. I think deep down we both already know how this is going to pan out. Let me force your hand. He reached into his pocket, and in an instant my heart was in my mouth. Don't move, You'll be needing these. He threw something towards me. I caught a glint of metal in the fading twilight. Did I mean to pull the trigger? I honestly don't know. It all happened in an instant. The crack of the pistol sounded obscenely loud coming from that dainty little toy gun. But the bullet somehow found its mark, despite my trembling hand. And the man who had been my constant companion for the last 12 months instantly crumpled to the ground. I looked down to see what he had thrown at me. 2 bullets, with a Derringer lying in the dirt by my feet. I dragged his body into some bushes by the side of the road and sat in the van to think. I rolled myself a cigarette to calm my nerves. As the van filled with smoke, I loaded up the gun with the 2 bullets I'd been given. I sat there for a very long time, loaded gun cradled in my hand. Eventually, I came to a decision. I put the gun back in my pocket, started up the van, and drove out to the bridge, the place where it had all began. Maybe my companion had been right. Things should turn full circle. The events of the last year cycled round and round in my skull. There was no way I could go back to living a normal, humdrum life. Not after everything I had seen. There was simply no place for me in that world anymore. Everything had lost its luster. When your only choice is no choice, you just do what has to be done. I pulled up at the bridge and got out of the van, walking towards the parapet. I felt empty, numb, like a machine just going through the motions. Then I stopped dead in my tracks. There was a figure already standing there, framed in the cheap neon glow of the streetlight, gazing down into the still waters below. Another pilgrim, a fellow traveler. I let out a dry, sardonic laugh and walked towards the bridge, my fingers lightly caressing the Derringer in my pocket. After all, when you really think about it, a year's really not a long time at all, is it?
Just south of Heidelberg sits Blackwater Swamp. Travel far enough in and you'll find the Harlow Estate. There's no local legends or ghost stories about it, and if you were to ask any of the locals about the estate, you'd come to the conclusion that no one cares. The Harlow Estate is, or rather was, a large 2-story house that sits on a private island. Over the years, local kids started using the place to throw wild parties. That became sort of a tradition that lasted for years till a particularly nasty hurricane season essentially destroyed the place. Slowly but surely it was abandoned and left to rot away in the swamp. Even though most people ignored it, my friends and I still went there from time to time. There were 3 of us, Victor, Willie, and me, Carl. The swamp wasn't the safest place. Alligators, wild hogs, snakes, and spiders were the usual, but we were used to it. It was the summer of our senior year in high school, and we had all graduated and wanted to throw one last party at the estate before life pulls us away. Vic was in charge of beer and weed, Willie was bringing his hunting gear, and I was borrowing my cousin's airboat. The plan was to invite a bunch of people, but we kind of forgot we weren't what you'd consider popular. Of course, no one showed up, which was fine with me, but now we were stuck with way too much beer, and Nowhere near enough weed. Cracking the cap of a fresh beer, Willie stood and raised his drink. Before he could spit out some corny toast, we started throwing rocks at him. "Boo!" Vic called out. "If you say one more word, I promise you're swimming back," he added, nudging me and laughing at the look on Willie's face. One thing led to another, and before we knew it, we were drunk. Right about here is where I had the genius idea of going inside the house to get some photos. The walk from our camp to the estate took a little longer than it should have, but considering how blitzed we were, I'm surprised we made it at all. As the estate came into view, we were shocked at how bad it looked. Creeping vines had overtaken the front of the house, snaking their way up the walls and pouring in through the broken windows. The old wrought iron fence was a rusted heap nearly hidden by piles of debris from the flooding. Chugging the last of his beer, Willie tossed the can, then aimed his flashlight at me. I say, since this your idea, you go in first." Before I could say anything, Vic seconded the motion, then shoved me towards the path leading in. Laughing it off, I shrugged and turned my attention to the house. The place was a mess. Most of the roof was missing, and what was there had collapsed. By the looks of it, we wouldn't be in there long. As soon as I stepped onto the path, I noticed the ground was soft. I didn't see anything out the ordinary till we were near the front steps. There were clusters of red-capped mushrooms growing on every inch of exposed concrete. We literally had to walk through them to reach the front door, and by the time I stepped inside, I looked like a powdered donut. Taking a moment to dust myself off, I looked around. Murky black water stood knee-deep throughout the first floor. I could hear something splashing around. I guessed it was a frog or something, 'cause it didn't sound big. Straight ahead of me, I could see the main stairway was still standing strong, but there was something wrong. On the second-floor landing, there was a statue of a woman with what I thought was a child standing next to her. Focusing my light on it, I paused. The thing standing next to her was a creature. From the waist down, it was an alligator, and from the waist up, it was a human. But the face was a horrible combination of the two. Its oblong skull was lumpy and deformed, with features I couldn't clearly define as human or gator. Slightly stammering through my words, I called to the others. "Hey, do you guys remember a statue in here?" There was a long moment of silence before Vic poked his head in and froze when he saw what my light was on. "Whoa, where'd that come from?" he asked, stepping inside while motioning for Willie to follow him. Once we were all standing there, Willie laughed.
Hey, you gotta be fake. Who'll go through the trouble of putting something like that up?
Our combined drunk logic said he was right, and to prove it, Vic sloshed through the water, then climbed up the stairs to see for himself. "Damn, this thing is creepy," he called back to us before trying to shove the statue. When it didn't budge, he stepped back, scratching at his neck. "Holy shit, it's a real statue." Wanting to get a look, Willie joined him, leaving me standing by the door. The layout of the place hadn't changed much. Other than the smell and the water, the hall to my left was partially blocked off by a collapsed ceiling. The large room to my right was overgrown by the vines coming in through the window and small clusters of those mushrooms. From what I could see, the hall leading to the kitchen was clear. The water would be deeper there, but it led to the back of the house. I was pretty sure the second floor was useless. There wasn't much there to start, so we weren't missing anything. We goofed around for a while, taking pictures and recording video for Willie's YouTube channel, then made our way to the kitchen. From there, we could take the back door to the garden so we could see if our wheat plants survived. Technically, they weren't our plants. Over the years, lots of people planted seeds. It was another one of those traditions that started long before we ever saw this place. Aside from the garden, there were 3 smaller buildings behind the main house. No one ever used them because they were falling apart. The odds were there wasn't much left. By the time we made it to the kitchen, the water was waist deep. It didn't take long to realize a flaw in our plan. Standing water is a breeding ground for mosquitoes, and we were being eaten alive every step of the way. Making matters worse, there was so much debris piled against the back of the house we couldn't get the door open. After searching for a few minutes, I found a hole in the wall big enough for us to go through, but we had to crawl, and that meant being underwater for a few seconds. It was obvious this was a blank trip. There was no way anything survived, but we did it anyway. I went through last. While I was waiting for Vic to clear the hole, there was a splash from somewhere behind me. Glancing back to the hall, a ripple rolled across the water coming towards me. I didn't see anything, but I knew there was something there. Quickly checking to see if the way was clear, I hurried through to catch up to the others. The second I stood up, Willie tapped me. "Don't move," he muttered as I wiped the water from my face. When my vision cleared, my jaw dropped. There was a massive uprooted tree lying in front of us, but that wasn't the problem. What had to be 100 swamp rats were perched on top of it, staring down at us. Moving slowly, Vic eased over and whispered, "I think we should get back inside." As the words left his lips, the rats started jumping in the water. The next thing we knew, we were under attack. "Go, go, go!" I yelled, watching the beady-eyed horde swim towards us. In a mad scramble, we dove back through that hole and tore ass through that house. We ran all the way back to our campsite. Stinking of stagnant water and covered with mosquito bites, we stood there stumped, staring at nothing. Our boat was gone, and the camp was trashed. "Jack's gonna kill me! How am I supposed to tell him his boat got stolen?" I blurted out excitedly while pointing to where it had been. Walking up to the edge of the water, Willie replied,
"Fuck Jack! How are we getting home?"
The realization that we were stranded landed like a bomb. We had our phones, but there was no cell service in the swamp. The 3 of us stood there silently looking at what was left of our camp. Whoever had done this hadn't taken our supplies, but they were scattered on the ground. Willie's hunting gear was intact. There were 3 life vests and 2 overturned coolers. Aside from the boat problem, things could have been worse. Turning over one of the coolers and taking a seat on it, Vic shook his head. "If this is a joke, it ain't funny," he said before picking up a beer, cleaning it off and opening it. "I bet it was the Gentrys. They've been after us since last year." The Gentrys, Adam and Thomas, the year before we'd trapped them in a shipping container with a skunk. In our defense, it had been payback for them locking me in a porta toilet and pushing it over. Scooping up a beer for myself, I glanced over at Willie. He was picking up the life vest and mumbling something to himself. Shrugging it off, I wiped the can clean, opened it, and took a sip. Nah. If it was them, we'd know it by now. They'd have stuck around just to rub our noses in it. Besides, those 2 are dumber than dirt. I don't think they could come up with a prank this good. Vic nodded in agreement, then took a drink. We batted a few more ideas around, but Willie had been oddly silent. The entire time we'd been talking, he'd been staring out at the swamp with the life vest in his hands. "Hey, what you doing?" Vic asked, trying to get his attention. Without responding, Willie slipped the vest on, then started walking towards the water. Seeing what he was doing, we snapped into action. We managed to catch him just as his feet got wet. But the moment one of us touched him, he started yelling,
"Let me go! I can't stay here!"
He was frantic. It took the 2 of us to drag him away from the water, and he fought us the entire time. He wouldn't calm down. We literally had to pin him to the ground till he gave up. When he finally stopped fighting, he kept muttering,
"I can't stay here. I can't stay here,"
while rocking in his seat. I kept an eye on him while Vic got a fire started. Then we took turns watching him till we eventually fell asleep. Well, I couldn't tell you how long I was out, but the fire was still burning, so it couldn't have been long. I lay there staring up at the stars for a while. The crackling of the flames mixed with the sounds of the swamp was almost hypnotic. For a moment I forgot just how screwed we were. Then I heard something in the distance. At first it was faint, but as I focused it became clear. A voice called out,
Help! Please, somebody help me!
I sat up looking around, but I didn't see anyone. Getting to my feet, I made sure Willie was still asleep. He and Vic were out cold, so I knew it wasn't one of them, but the voice was still there. Moving slowly, I went to the water's edge and looked further out. That's when I saw someone. There was a kid splashing around in the water. I couldn't tell if it was a boy or a girl, but by the looks of it, whoever they were in trouble. Kicking off my boots, I rushed in and started swimming out to help. As I got closer, the splashing stopped and the voice went silent. There was no point in diving under to find them. The water was murky in broad daylight. At night, it would be like trying to see through mud. I swam out to the exact place I'd seen the kid, but there was nothing there. There wasn't much I could do, and being in the water after dark was dangerous, so I turned to start swimming back. I'd made it close to halfway when the voice cried out from behind me.
Help!
Good thing I was in the water, because I'm pretty sure I pissed myself when I turned and saw what was there. Maybe 10 feet away from me, I saw someone staring at me. The top of the person's head was sticking out of the water, but it wasn't moving.
Are you okay?
I called out, but there was no reply. The moment I made a move towards it, the head dipped below the water. I'd seen enough. I turned away and started swimming back to shore as fast as I could. I'm a decent swimmer, so I figured whoever it was wouldn't be able to catch me. But I was wrong. Something slammed into me, and a surge of pain shot up my left leg. Everything happened so fast I didn't have a chance to react. I was snatched under and immediately spun head over heels. My first thought was death row. A gator had me and I was about to be ripped apart. I felt my shin snap under the pressure as my body was ragdolled to the point I couldn't tell up from down. Fear flooded my body like the swamp water that was filling my lungs, and I blacked out. I guess the commotion woke the others because the next thing I knew, Vic was pulling me out of the water.
What the fuck were you doing out there?
He asked before seeing my mangled leg.
Holy shit. Don't move. I'll be right back.
Hopping to his feet, Vic hurried past Willie, who was sitting up, scratching the side of his face and muttering to himself. Still groggy, I puked up some water, then glanced down at my leg and started screaming. The skin of my shin had been stripped away, revealing broken bones and shredded muscle. I hadn't realized to that moment that I couldn't feel my leg. By the time Vic got back with the first aid kit from Willie's bag, I was in full panic mode. Once he finally got me still enough to bandage me up, I blacked out again. When I came to, Vic was sitting by the fire. He was bloody from setting my leg and he looked exhausted, but Willie was gone.
Where'd he go?
I asked as I sat halfway up, supporting myself with my elbow. Closing his eyes and tilting his head back, Vic took a deep breath and tried to calm himself.
While I was working on your leg, he took off. Before I could stop him, he put on that dumbass vest and got in the water. He wouldn't come back. I tried to get him to turn around, but he just kept going. What was I supposed to do? You were bleeding all over the place. I couldn't leave you there and go after him.
Flopping back down, I tried to focus. My head was spinning and I felt sick. For the time being, I decided not to say anything about the kid I saw in the water. It would just add more problems, and all I wanted to do was go home. The sun would be up soon. Even though no one came to the estate anymore, there were a few guys that fished in the area, so there was a chance we'd get spotted if we stayed put. Since technically I didn't have a choice, staying where we were made sense. As the morning rolled in, I almost wanted to cry. Thick gray clouds hung high in the sky. Rain was coming. Great, I muttered to myself before glancing over at Vic. He hadn't moved since I woke up. Can't say I blame him. This whole situation was out of control, and by the look of it, about to get worse. Thunder rumbled across the sky as the first few drops started to fall. Looking up, laughing sarcastically, Vic threw up his hands.
Oh, come on, man, seriously. What the fuck is wrong with you? Go away!
He shouted at the clouds while fanning both hands to the side as if he were clearing them out. In most cases, this would seem strange, but that's Vic. Ever since we were kids, he talked to the clouds. He said it was something his granny taught him.
There's good clouds and bad clouds. The good ones listen and the bad ones do what they want.
He'd say it every time he saw rain coming. Shrugging his shoulders, he turned his attention to me.
We can't be this close to the water. Looks like the bad clouds are here to stay.
As much as I didn't want to risk moving, I knew he was right. The water rises fast in the swamp. It could go from bad to worse in a heartbeat. The only thing we had going for us was Willie's hunting gear. Aside from the first aid kit, he'd brought his .22 long rifle with extra ammo in his pack. There were also a few cans of corned beef, Spam, and chili along with some flares and a map of the area. I remember making fun of him for bringing all that stuff to a party, but I was glad he had done it now. Hoping the rain would pass through, we opted to take shelter a little further in, beneath the hanging moss trees. After an hour, it was clear the rain wasn't letting up. Vic yawned and leaned back against a tree.
I don't think anyone's coming. Not right now, at least. Maybe we should move inside. It might not be perfect, but we'd be dry.
He had a point. Besides, even if someone were to come by, they wouldn't have seen us under the trees. Going inside was probably the best choice. Once he had gathered the gear and helped me up, we made our way to the house. Somehow the rain made the place look creepier than it had before. Thinking about swarming mosquitoes and hordes of swamp rats almost made me change my mind.
Look, we made it to the Mushroom Kingdom,
Vic said jokingly as he helped me up the stairs. Every step we took released a cloud of spores. The rain kept it down, but it was still sticking to us as we crossed through the doorway. Once we were inside, he sat me next to the opening, then flopped down a few feet away. We were wet and cold. It was a miserable situation, but being inside was a hell of a lot better than sitting under a tree. After a short rest, Vic got up and started looking around.
I'm gonna go look for some dry wood. We might be able to get a small fire going,
he said, getting to his feet and stretching. There was no point in arguing. It wasn't like I could stop him. I watched him search for a moment before I noticed something was different. The statue of the creature wasn't there anymore.
I think there's someone else here,
I said, pointing to where it had been. Vic paused and looked for himself, then scratched his head.
Well, if someone else is here, they need to get their asses in gear and help us, he replied before yelling. You hear me? Get out here and give us a hand.
He stood there silently for a moment before shouldering the rifle and pointing it to the stairs.
I'm going to the second floor. There might be something we can use up there. Hang tight, I'll be right back.
I watched as he sloshed through the murky water, then made his way up to the next floor.
Once he was out of sight, I sat there listening to the thunder, trying not to think about the throbbing pain from my leg. I couldn't help but wonder about Willie. That was a long swim, and now that it was raining, the odds were he hadn't made it very far. As that thought crossed my mind, Vic came bounding down the stairs, carrying a metal wash tub he had filled with bits of dry scrap wood.
"Bingo, gringo! We've got action,"
he announced, holding up his haul so I could see it. I was surprised he had found anything, but having a fire to warm us up felt like the best idea ever. After poking a few holes in the wash tub, Vic piled the scraps in and lit the fire. We sat tossing in extra pieces till the flames were high enough to make a difference, then got comfortable and watched the rain. Eventually, Vic fell asleep. For the first few minutes, I couldn't take my eyes off the statue. There was something so familiar about her face. She reminded me of a picture I'd seen somewhere, but I couldn't place it. A loud splash from the hall caused me to look in that direction. We hadn't had a chance to see what was down there, but from what I could remember, it was the dining room. Out of the corner of my eye, I could have sworn the statue moved. It was a slight turn of her head, but when I looked, it hadn't budged. Wincing and laughing at myself, I rubbed my leg, trying to ease the pain. There were dark veins spreading up my thigh, and it was warm to the touch. I was pretty sure it was infected. Letting out a sigh, I leaned back, propping myself up against the wall. It was getting harder to stay calm, but panicking wasn't going to make things any better. Time passed slowly as I watched the water rising. We were going to need to move to higher ground if it kept up, and the only place I could think of was the landing where the statue was standing. A part of me was hanging on to the hope that Willie made it and was on the way back with help. The rest of me just hoped he wasn't dead. Closing my eyes and tilting my head back, I tried to relax. The squeaking of a rat changed that instantly. More out of surprise than fear, I turned and spotted it was swimming towards us. Wood rats are big bastards to begin with, but these were huge. From a distance, I'd swear it was a possum. The minute I laid eyes on it, more of them came swimming out of the hall, sounding off. As the squeaks and squeals filled the air, I tried to wake Vic, but he wouldn't move. I had to get the rifle. Using my arms and one good leg, I dragged myself to where it was sitting. Praying for a good shot, I grabbed it, turned and fired without aiming. I missed. The lead rat climbed out of the water and rushed me as I checked another round, then fired. It was a hit, but it didn't matter. As the one fell, 3 more took its place, and behind that another dozen with more on the way. All I could do was cover myself as the horde stampeded over us. Dozens of them clawing and scrambling for the door. They weren't attacking. They were running, and we were in the way. When it was over, and the last of them vanished into the rain, an eerie calm settled in. Vic was sound asleep. I thought he was dead till he stirred a little, then started snoring. Laughing and shaking my head, it dawned on me. The rats were running away from something. "Shit," I muttered. There were 8 shots left. Once I reloaded, I tried waking Vic again. "Get up, man. We gotta go. There's..." The sound of something big splashing around in the kitchen cut me off. I could hear it bumping against the walls of the hall for a moment, then it stopped. Loud sniffing followed by a low growl forced me to swallow the lump in my throat as I took aim. If it was a gator, the rifle wouldn't stop it unless I hit its soft spot at the base of its skull. That meant I'd have to be either standing or above it. I was fucked. I kept waiting for a massive gator to come charging in, but nothing happened. I wasn't about to stick around. I knew there was something in that hallway even though I couldn't see it. The door was a few feet away. I could possibly drag myself out, but there was no way I could leave Vic. Scooting to the door, I placed the rifle outside, then turned back and grabbed him by the arms. It was going to take a lot, but it had to be done. I strained and pulled using my right leg to help and managed to get us both halfway through the door. That's when it attacked. The first thing I saw was its head. An elongated mass of flesh, colored scales emerged from the water, snapping its jaws and reaching out with almost human-looking hands. I was still pulling at Vic's arms, trying desperately to drag him out, but it was too late. The creature grabbed him by the legs and snatched him away, causing me to fall back, landing in a bed of mushrooms. I was instantly engulfed by a cloud of spores. My eyes were burning and I couldn't breathe. Gasping for air, I sat up in time to see that thing bite into Vic's hip and tear off his leg before dragging the rest back in the water. Rubbing spores from my eyes, I reached for the rifle and froze when I heard rustling from the bushes to my right. There was just enough time for me to glance in that direction. A smaller version of what I had just seen launched itself at me. I felt it grip my shoulder and wrist, forcing my arm straight while simultaneously biting down on it. There was a loud crunch and my fingers went numb as the little bastard landed, then immediately went into a death roll. All I could do was gasp. It happened so fast my brain hadn't processed the pain. As the creature rolled for the first time, the momentum slammed me face first into the ground, knocking out my front teeth. The second roll snapped bone and tore tendons to shreds. The third took everything from the elbow down. The creature backed away, eating, while I flopped around, spraying blood and screaming at the top of my lungs. It finished my arm and was about to attack when a shot rang out. It snarled at me, then quickly turned and scrambled away, vanishing in the overgrown brush. Gunfire echoed around me as the pain kicked in and my body shut down. The last thing I saw was Sheriff Landry, standing over me looking down. I was in a coma for 3 days and in the hospital for a month. I lost my arm. They had to amputate my leg due to infection, and my friends were dead. According to the doctors, the spores we inhaled caused us to hallucinate. We'd gotten dosed and stumbled into an alligator's nesting area. I told them about the creatures and the statues. They said the statue of the woman was an art exhibit from Crimson Creek, which is a town east of Blackwater Swamp. They showed me pictures. I instantly recognized it, but there was no creature with her. When I asked about it, I was told it had to have been a hallucination brought on by the spores. The more they explained everything, the more I started to believe their version of what happened. As it turns out, Willie was the reason they found me. His mangled torso was discovered by fishermen. The life vest had my cousin's info written in it, so they contacted him. Jack told them where we had gone. They found his airboat not far from where they had found Willie. All they recovered of Vic was his head and one of his legs. When it was all said and done, the whole thing was written up as a horrible accident. When I finally got out the hospital, I slipped into a deep depression. Both families blamed me for the deaths and I had to agree. It was my idea. They died because of me. Months passed before I finally looked through my phone. The photos and videos were still there. One photo in particular brought my world to a screeching halt. It was a picture I'd taken of Willie and Vic standing by the two statues. The thing that made my heart drop was the fact that the light from my camera's flash reflected in the creature's eyes. It wasn't a statue. It had been right in front of us, and we were too drunk to see it. In the video, I literally saw it turn to look at us. I posted everything online and told everyone that would listen, but no one believed me. They thought I was trying to make money off the death of my best friend.
That led me to do some research on the creature itself. All I found were some pictures of Jack the Alligator Man. No one's been able to help me, and most people think I've gone crazy. The only person that believes me is my cousin Jack, but everyone thinks he's crazy, so having him on my side doesn't help much. He wants me to go back there. That's not happening. There's no combination of words known to man that could convince me to set foot in Blackwater again. Since I refused to go, Jack said he's going out there alone. His plan is to torch the estate and kill anything he finds. I've been trying to talk him out of it, but he won't listen. The only thing stopping him right now is his airboat. It was badly damaged when they found it. The repairs should be finished next week. That buys me a little time. If I can talk him out of it, this will be my last post. If I can't, this will still probably be my last post. It's been real. This is Carl Grant, signing off.
Chapter 1. Tanner Lee Pelper, or Tilper, as people had called him even before he could remember, sat on the old rustic bench he had put by the pond years ago. His pole sat leaned against the limb that jutted towards him from the water. It was his fishing branch, and his bobber slowly floated in circles. He figured the worm below the surface must be wriggling, attempting to escape the hook its slim, dangly, twisting body hid. Tilper noticed the tiny rings that echoed out and away from the red and white plastic ball. The liquid palpitations mesmerized him into a state of hypnosis as each movement of the worm created another ring cascading across the glassy surface topside. Certainly such wriggles would entice a hungry bass or possibly trout. Tilper's spring-fed pond stretched out about 3.5 acres. It sat south through the woods of his property, a lengthy walking distance from his home. Tilper's parents had left him the homestead he had grown up on and still resided. All 35 acres were wooded with steep hills and rocky ridges surrounding his pond. The walnut and oak trees camouflaged several small cave openings. The Little Sac River skirted one edge of his property, and he kept a canoe chained to a tree surrounded by brush about 30 feet from the shore. He knew this property well and only left it to get groceries and supplies. He held no need for people, for the most part. Winter was now on the cusp of returning, and the colder weather had begun to bring the depression and pain along with the dropping of the fall leaves. Tilper felt very small and alone in the forest now that his parents were deceased. A man of only 24 shouldn't be allowed to let his life shrivel and dry up, becoming so atrophied. Living alone let the haunts of lonesomeness invade his mental state in paralyzing ways. Tilper hadn't wanted it this way, but life brings unwanted gifts along the journey sometimes, withdrawing more each day, a little farther into the recesses of the torment he felt surrounded in. The people from the nearby town put up with him, but never really welcomed his presence. Once upon a time, his freshman year, he had been a local hero of sorts for a short time, back before the accident. Nowadays, the townspeople just took his money for the supplies he purchased, but never included him in conversations or gatherings. That was fine with Tilper, though. He learned to not much care for people. After all, people hurt one another. They looked down their noses at people. People like him. Tilper would load up his groceries in his dad's old Ford truck along with his big blue-gray pit bull and head back to the shack in the woods, home where he felt safe and secure. His old truck seemed to know on its own when to turn off the highway and onto the old farm road that led to the stone bridge, which stood high over the Sac River. The front tires would slowly roll into the downhill curve that led to the sharp turn before crossing onto it. Tilper would idle the truck slowly across, and many times, if another farmer were behind, They lay onto their horn in hopes of pushing old Tilper to pick up speed so they could pass as soon as they crossed and left the narrow bridge behind. It never worked, and Tilper would ignore the yells through their windows and the mean finger they would display at him. He'd never respond back with the like, and I imagined that more than likely prodded their anger for him even further. On cold nights, Tilper would work on making his hand-carved fiddles right there on the cement floor of his metal shack he lived in. The home his parents and he had shared, now left in a charred pile no more than a couple 100 feet from the metal storage barn he fixed up enough to live. The tin shack. Tilper missed his parents and the comforts of the home he had grown up in. The memories still seemed fresh, though, and the tin shack had heat and running water. He was comfortable and satisfied with simplicity. Somehow, he had escaped the ravaging flames that night some 2.5 years ago, the fire that killed both of his parents, along with destroying the home. Sometimes after a rain, the scent of fire and burning wood remained and wafted over to the tin shack, reminding Tilper of what he had lost and somehow lived through. He had been blamed at first by the townspeople for setting the fire, which of course was ludicrous. He loved his parents and had no one else other than them. What would be the reasoning? There was no insurance money. Their family was poor and struggled for everything they had. All that was left to him that hadn't been burned up was the 35 acres, a 1976 ugly Ford F-150 truck, and the tin shack, heated by firewood. It did have plumbing and was insulated with pieces of random styrofoam, but it was nothing to look at and surely held little value monetarily. No, he'd have held no reason to burn everything up. Chapter 2. Tilper sat on a stool in front of the Ben Franklin stove, which was tightly snuggled into the corner of his shack near the front door. The warming flames rippled and sparkled from the stacked logs within. The crackles and pops filled in the background of the otherwise emptiness of his home. Wheeler, his best and only real friend, lay sleeping on the wadded-up comforter next to his feet. Tilper nestled the piece of thin walnut in his lap and lightly pulled a razor-sharp hand scraper across the hourglass-shaped piece of wood, honing its body into a smooth-to-touch perfect piece. The dark grain was beautiful and would make a very handsome instrument when he was completed. The perfect Christmas present for the only girl he had ever had eyes for, Emily Sue Merriweather. He remembered before the accident she had asked his fellow teammate about him. It had made the school buzz. One of the prettiest girls asking about the awkward wide receiver for the Ash Grove Pirates. The memory still came to mind after all these years passed. Just the sound of Tilper silently speaking her name in thought sent chords of a lovely melody throughout his veins. She had been the only one outside his family that gave him happy thoughts. She had been nice to him back in their school days when so many others were not. She too had stayed in the area while many of the others moved off after graduating high school. She played violin and played beautifully, even way back then. He would hear her throughout the years at the town's festivals or at church. He was a silent admirer from a quiet distance, never feeling in her league to move forward in any way other than a little wave or smile from the crowd. Even after the praise of his football abilities, he never felt worthy enough to approach Emily Sue. Something Tilper never had been privy to was that Emily Sue, even with her beauty, had grown up feeling very similar to his feelings of inadequacies to the social life of high school and the other kids. Tilper nor Emily Sue had no conditions mentally or medically to be so withdrawn. It was just the circumstances of makeup. Quiet, withdrawn families that each stuck to themselves, rarely venturing out much with others other than church. Small towns can be difficult cultures to break into if you live on the outskirts and aren't outwardly overt to others. Families can quickly become labeled poorly among the small cliques. This is the unfortunate outcome of the Pappers and the Merriweathers. Hours would pass as Tilper scraped and honed the wooden parts he created from the old downed walnut tree on his property. He shaped and formed the wooden pieces into an incredible piece of musical art. While he tried to play back in school, he could never master much more than sour screeches and poorly tuned notes. What he lacked in musical talent, he made up in woodcrafting. he would be able to finish the gift for Emily Sue before the church's Christmas celebration in 2 weeks. Now he'd just need to muster up the courage to give his gift to the only girl he ever admired and was sweet on, but lacked the courage in letting her know his secret. Chapter 3. Rodney Lane Miles was the starring quarterback in 1978. It was the year Tilper and he ruled the field together and stunned the town of Ash Grove while putting it on the map. The magic of Rodney's bold passing game and Tilper's hands managing to catch anything thrown close to him was a perfect combination. Rodney had held doubts at first when he met Tilper. After all, Tilper didn't really look or act like someone of knowledge, talent, or love of the game. Rodney's family recently moved into the area from Kansas City. He had grown up football. After the first several summer practices, Rodney sensed a talent in Tilper. He befriended him that first year as much as one could befriend an odd kid like Tilper. That first game was magical. The two couldn't seem to miss. They slaughtered Greenfield 42-0. The local news channels went crazy talking up that first game. Rodney and Tilper soon became the talk of town. Unfortunately, after a 10-0 winning streak, the magic died instantly. The brain injury that was caused by a nasty tackle on Tilper at the 10-yard line ended his short-lived winning career with high school football and the Pirates. He was out for the last game of the season, and even after recovery, never came back to the field ever again. Soon, the kindred friendship with Rodney went sour also. Neil Ballard took Tilper's place alongside Rodney for the last game and shoulder to shoulder at school. That last game of Rodney's first season on the Pirates ended in a horrible loss. Neil had kept up on receiving touchdown passes all the way until halftime. It appeared Neil was the perfect replacement for Tilper. But something went south and they ended the Rodney and Tilper's previous winning season with a 28-41 loss. And to a team whose record had been 2-8. Ash Grove's next 2 seasons with Rodney and Neil failed miserably. Their fame withered away. The simple truth was, Rodney resented Tilper from that tragic night of the injury till he graduated. The talk was that he also pursued Emily Sue just to spite Tilper, knowing how he quietly felt about her. Now, though, it was water far under the bridge. Rodney ended up joining the Army after graduation, and soon his family left Ash Grove too. Emily Sue never gave in to Rodney's attempts to date. Life moved by slowly and quietly, admirations silent and unknown. Everyone always questioned why Emily Sue, so pretty of a girl, never dated or found anyone to be serious with. No one ever thought about Tilper being single, though. In fact, no one ever thought much of anything about Tilper. He just faded off into obscurity as the awkward, quiet boy whose parents died in a suspicious fire outside of town. No one even remembered he had been a huge part of the 1978 nearly undefeated winning season of the Pirates. The year Ash Grove High ended up losing the state championship. Deep down, Rodney held Tilper accountable throughout his last 2 years as they never repeated another winning season, besides the games that he and Tilper had ruled playing together up until the injury that stole the magic. Chapter 4. Emily Sue Merriweather laid the receipt for the meal on Joe Massey's table. "I hope everything met your satisfaction, Mr. Massey."
"Emily Sue, I've been coming in here every morning for the last 30 years. About 16 years longer than you've been working here. You do know my name is Joe, don't you?"
He smiled as he stuck the toothpick into the gap between his 2 front teeth.
"Damn it, girl, you make me feel old with the Mr. stuff."
"I'm sorry, Joe. I surely don't want to make you feel that way. I guess I just feel the need to show respect. I'll try not to make you feel old again."
"You gonna play violin this Christmas at the church again? You sure have an ear and talent, Emily Sue."
She blushed. "Why, thank you, Joe. And yes, I plan on it. Pastor Jesse expects it every year now. He says the Christmas Eve service wouldn't be the same without it."
Joe smiled. "Pastor Jesse would be correct. If I happen to be short of the proper spirit of Christmas up till Christmas Eve,
Your beautiful violin playing always speeds me back into that spirit of joy at the last minute. Sometimes that's difficult now that the missus passed." "I'm sure it's difficult this time of year, Joe. My thoughts and prayers will be with you in mind, and I'll do my best to usher the proper spirit into your holiday." Emily Sue heard the familiar sound of a certain Ford truck and shifted her gaze toward the window just in time to see Tilper's old truck idle down Main Street past Lydia's diner. Tilper quickly looked to his left to see if he'd catch a glimpse of Emily Sue at a table. Yep, there she was. "This is the year I'm going to give Miss Merriweather a Christmas present." Tilper quickly turned when he saw Emily Sue look out the window his way. He swore he noticed a sweet smile and glimmer in her eye. Nah, surely not. Just my imagination. Chapter 5. It was Christmas Eve and the temperature had dropped very timely in the last several weeks. Thanksgiving was unseasonably warm, and Tilper was glad the odd and untimely heat wave had retreated, bringing normal temperatures and the possible chance for snow back into the area's forecast. He looked at the single wrapped gift neatly tucked under his freshly cut cedar tree. Wheeler peeked up from his comforter bed on the floor with his sad eyes and tail gently beginning to wag at the sight of his master eyeing him. "Do you think she'll accept my gift, Wheeler? Will she like it?" Tilper calmly asked. Wheeler's tail wagged with more gusto and steadiness. "So you think so, buddy?" Tilper smiled. He hoped he hadn't overdone it. He had barely squeaked out a hello every time he had gone to get scrambled eggs, bacon, and pancakes at Lydia's diner. They were tasty, but he couldn't really afford to eat them as regularly as he had liked. He just had to see Emily Sue's sweet face at least a time or two every week. She always treated him so nicely at the diner, and at Sunday church, of course. Tilper was proud of the instrument he had made. It was by far the best he had completed to date. He even hand-carved a pair of beautiful intertwined hearts on the face just below the bottom sound hole. He had hoped she liked it and wouldn't be too embarrassed or bothered by the carving. It was a one-of-a-kind. He had bleached the carved hearts so they were lighter than the walnut, and then had mixed a special red dye and stained them. They had just the right hint of red as to not stick out too boldly, but were visible. He also carved his name on the back, Tilper. Even Emily Sue called him by his nickname. He wasn't sure anyone really knew his given name was Tanner Lee. It was as if it really weren't. The only time he had been called Tanner Lee was by his mama. Even his daddy called him Tilper. He looked outside as the sun began to drop below the horizon. His little tin shack sat in the middle of the woods, and even though most all vegetation was long gone from the trees and shrubs, it still became darker around his shack quicker than anywhere else. He could hardly wait until tonight's midnight service. Tonight would be special. Chapter 6. There were the beginnings of a good dusting of snow as Tilper's old Ford rolled onto the parking lot of Pastor Jesse's church. Several cars were already parked, and the stained glass windows appeared extra beautiful behind the snowflakes wafting down slowly. It just looked warm and inviting inside. It was Christmas Eve, and Tilper's heart felt warm with the spirit of giving. He had worn his best clothes and carried in his beautifully wrapped package. He hoped to see Emily Sue first thing, while he had his courage up. As he walked through the front door, he immediately spied Pastor Jesse. "Pastor, sir, Merry Christmas. Is Emily Sue here yet?" He spit the sentences out so quickly it drew a smile from Jesse Gibson. "Why, yes she is, Tilper. She's in the choir room readying herself for the program. You're free to peek in and wish her Merry Christmas. I'm sure she'd love that." "Thank you, sir. That's why I came a bit early. I have a present for her, sir. I was thinking that beautiful gift looked very intriguing. I'm certain she will cherish whatever it is." Jesse nodded and smiled and held out his hand for the Jenkins, who just stepped in behind Tilper. "Thank you, sir. I'll just go see her real quick like. I won't keep her too long, sir." Tilper nervously walked to the choir room door and stood for a second. He was trying to work up the courage to turn the doorknob. "Here you go, Tilper. Bobby reached over and twisted the knob, pushing the door wide open. Sometimes it sticks. Emily Sue's eyes shot to the opening door, half startled. For some reason, her nerves got the best of her every time just before showtime. Her eyes appeared as two startled full moons for a second. I'm so sorry, Emily Sue. I mean, Bobby, push the door. Her look of being startled quickly morphed into a warm smile. It's okay, Tilper, really. I'm glad you came in. I'm just nervous and, jitters and all. But Merry Christmas, Tilper. I'm glad to see you. You are kind of a sight for sore eyes. I'm calmer now. Merry Christmas, Emily Sue. I made this for you. I've wanted to do this for some time now, and, well, Christmas seemed like the perfect time. I hope it's okay I done this. He nervously held out the gift towards her as she walked closer to him. Oh, Tilper, it's wrapped beautifully, but you shouldn't have. Christmas is the giving time, and Tilper stepped closer and put the package into Emily Sue's hands and stepped back. You don't have to open it now. You can just take it with you after the service if you want. Tilper, I wouldn't dream of not opening it in front of you. She motioned with a head nod toward the row of chairs. Please sit down with me. I've got plenty of time to see what's inside this beautiful wrapping. They both sat like nervous school kids back in the time of high school, and nerves and butterflies in the stomach. They slowly sat, and Emily Sue glanced up at Tilper as she held the gift on her lap. You look really handsome tonight. I mean, not that you don't always. Should I open it now? She asked timidly. Of course, Emily Sue. I was hoping you wouldn't wait until later. Who knows, you could use it sooner than you thought. Well, now you've got my curiosity up. Her fingers carefully slid under the fold of the taped paper as she slowly slid her finger the length of the box. I can't even imagine. I wish I could say I had a gift for you, but I had no idea that... It's okay, Emily Sue. I didn't expect a thing. The only gift I want is to watch your eyes sparkle as you open it. That's really sweet of you to say. She peeled back the paper and began to edge her fingernail into the tape that held the box flaps closed. After finally breaking the seal all the way around the top of the box, she looked up at Tilper with question. Is it okay to open it now? Of course it is, Emily Sue. It's yours. Tilper's eyes glistened with the excitement of a young boy on Christmas morning with gifts awaiting his hands to tear into. As she opened the flaps up and parted the tissue paper, one hand immediately went to her lips. Oh, it's beautiful, Tilper. A tear gently popped from her eye and began the slow descent down her cheek. She lifted her eyes up and looked directly into Tilper's. This is the most beautiful present I've ever received. Did you make this? She lifted it from the tissue and held it gently up to study it. Her lips mouthed, "Oh my," as she noticed the delicate carved and stained hearts, and then turned to look at its back and noticed his carved signature. I absolutely love it and will treasure it forever. She leaned over and with one arm reached around Tilper and pulled him into a hug. She pulled back and began to put the violin back into the box. I've got to put it down for a moment and give you a proper thank you hug. She turned back around and put both arms around him. Pulling him close enough, she whispered into his ear, I love this, Tilper. It means everything to me. How completely unexpected and sweet of you. She pulled closer again and maneuvered to where her lips could meet his for a kiss. That was when the door swung open suddenly. When they quickly pulled away from each other, no one other than Rodney was standing in the doorway. He looked shocked. Tilper? Emily Sue? Neither Emily Sue nor Tilper knew why they felt as if they had been caught in some horrible act, but the awkwardness set in quickly. I've got to prepare. Rodney, could you please close the door? Tilper, I want you to stay for a minute, please. The door banged to a close and Tilper quickly began to apologize. You have no reason to apologize for anything. You've done a very generous and loving thing by spending all of the time it must have taken to create this beautiful gift. I'll never forget it or let anything happen to it. It's gorgeous. And you are such a wonderful Christmas gift yourself. I'm very blessed tonight, and I want you to know how much you mean to me. Can we maybe go for a walk in the snow after the service or something? I won't want this Christmas Eve to end tonight now. You just gave me the best gift ever, Emily Sue. Your smile and a walk together on the best night I've ever had. He smiled. Now you need to prepare, and I need to go sit down and regroup these new emotions I'm feeling. Emily Sue smiled and pushed her lips in a quick kiss as Tilper turned and pushed the door to a soft close. As the lights went dimmer in the sanctuary, the beautiful melodic sound echoed throughout the Christmas-filled room. The pews all held garland on the ends. There were several Christmas trees decorated with white and red ribbon and angels. Candles filled the room and flickered as the Christmas carols echoed beautiful and willowy from a marvelous walnut violin, showcasing two hearts intertwined as Emily Sue's hand moved the bow in an orchestrated dance back and forth across the strings. She looked the happiest she had ever looked, and people whispered such back and forth to each other. At the close of the service, the congregation each held candles and sang Silent Night together to the wispy sound, quietly singing out the melodic tune everyone knew so well. As each blew out their candle before heading out into the snow in their homes, Rodney calmly walked over to his old football friend he hadn't seen for at least 5 years and whispered in his ear in nearly a hushed sentence no one else could make out, "Your silent night is coming. It'll be a cold one, too. You'll see." Tilper swore he saw the devil dancing in Rodney's eyes as he turned and walked out into the cold of the night. But Tilper's heart still felt so warm from Emily Sue's kiss, he shrugged the thought of Rodney and his threat off, instead choosing to hold warm thoughts and Emily Sue's hand as they walked around the snowy streets of Ash Grove's downtown. Snowflakes slowly danced around them as the colored lights in the window fronts twinkled on and off. Chapter 7. Tilper's eyes began to open. Wheeler stretched his legs and pushed on Tilper's back. Yep, queen-size bed, and once again, Wheeler has somehow scooted me to the very edge. As he pushed back against Wheeler, he began the struggle to roll over and surmise his dog's lying position. There sat 3/4 of unused bed, while he had been almost shoved off the side. Wheeler, if it wasn't Christmas morning, He shook his head while Wheeler lifted his up and stared at him with big brown loving eyes. Well, I wouldn't do nothing, and you know it. Both dropped their heads back down to the pillow. Tilper had no idea what Wheeler was thinking, but he himself couldn't wipe the big smile from his face. Last night was the best. He rolled back over to face Wheeler and threw his arm over him, rubbing the top of his head. Boy, life is different today. Very different. Merry Christmas. And he reached over, opening the drawer on his nightstand. He grabbed a brand new bright yellow tennis ball and tossed it toward the foot of the bed. Wheeler snapped around and almost beat the ball to the foot. The snow continued to fall most of Christmas Day. Tilper had invited Emily Sue over for an evening Christmas dinner. He spent late morning cleaning the house spotless. He hummed and whistled throughout, never dropping the smile he wore. About 7 o'clock, Tilper began to worry something had gone wrong. Emily Sue should have been there by now. He knew she was a punctual kind of person and would have called if she had changed her mind. The telephone rang and broke the silence. As Tilper reached to pick it up, he suddenly felt relief. Something must have kept her running late. Hello? A familiar voice spoke out, but it sounded cold and harsh. Tilper, Tilper, little lover boy. Hello? Is this Rodney? This is your devil, Tilper, a Grinch if you will, to come and steal your fucking Christmas. What do you mean, Rodney? Are you still mad about the game? Or Emily Sue? I got a present for you, little Tilper. It's down at your pond. Better hurry. Run fast. Click. The line went dead. Tilper grabbed for his Carhartt jacket, leaving Wheeler behind as the door quickly slammed closed. He was running in as long a stride as he could through the snow and down the trails towards the pond. It was cold and the ground was slick, spilling him to his knees several times. His determination was strong, but he was becoming winded, his heart pounding. He couldn't think. Why would Rodney be doing this? And on Christmas? Why was he even back in town? He had no family here, no friends. The only people left here in Ash Grove from those days were he and Emily Sue. He panted as icicles began to form in his mustache and goatee. The pond never seemed this far away. He suddenly had to stop a minute. He was sucking cold, moist air into his lungs, and it hurt. It burned deep within. He couldn't imagine what would be down at the pond for him to see. Would he be waiting there? Was he wanting to hurt him? Oh, shit, he thought. Wheeler wasn't with him. What if he needed him? His heart began to race even more, and he lifted his body upward from where he had been bent over, hands on his knees, attempting to catch his breath. I can't go back for Wheeler now. I gotta go. As Tilper raced down the hill, tromping through small drifts of snow, his hands bouncing grip from one tree to the other, he was about to reach his fishing spot when something caught his eye. There was a strange reddish clump in the middle of the pond and an odd stick figure poking up that he couldn't make out. His eyes scanned the area as he slowed to a fast-paced walk, attempting to make out what the debris in the water was and the tree line surrounding, in case Rodney or whatever was there waiting for him. His breath shot from his nose and mouth. The cold air steamed from his body. Sounds of strain escaped his lips along with the sucking of air back in. His eyes were blurred, and he attempted to wipe them clear with his cold fingers. There was silence. No birds, no squirrels, nothing but the noises he made. He began walking again towards the edge of the pond, staring and trying to make out what was out there. It didn't make sense. "Where are you, Rodney?" he cried out. "I'm here, damn it! What do you want from me?" As he came to the edge of the creek, he noticed something. All around, as far as he could see, the water's edge held a thin layer of ice, from the ground's edge and out about 1.5 feet or 2. Everywhere but one small spot about 30 feet from where he stood and to the left. That's when he noticed footprints in the snow that seemed disturbed and disrupted. Something appeared to have been dragged or been in a scuffle. The closer he looked, the more he saw that weeds and brush were bent over, and it just didn't look as if it matched the rest of the pristine white, untouched grounds. Tilper's eyes trailed from where the disturbance in the snow started, up just inside the tree line, and then he made his eyes follow the trail back down towards the pond's edge. He looked from the broken ice out to the center to the reddish clump with the odd twig, and that's when his heart slammed to a halt. His breath ceased, and his mind went temporarily numb until something clicked, and his legs began tromping quickly through the water to the center and the object. No, please God, no! Tears poured from his eyes, mixing with the splashes coming up off his knees, the cold, chilled wetness slamming into his face and stinging. The roar of moving water quickly began to flood his ears. It's all he could hear, except for his own voice screaming, "God, no! Please, no!" As he almost reached the floating clump, his mind rationalized what the twig had been. It was the violin neck he had made. It was rising from the clump of wet clothing or something. He struggled through the frigid water to get closer, only to realize it was a half-clothed body. He reached it and grabbed what he could to pull it up. An opened, torn red dress parted enough to see pale white and frozen skin. He lifted it with everything he had and began backing up towards land, hollering, "Emily Sue, please be okay, please." He backed as fast as he could until he tripped, pulling Emily Sue's body on top of him as he fell backwards and became swallowed up by the cold pond water. Emily Sue's body that he clung tightly to began crushing him further underwater as his clothes became heavily soaked and saturated. The more he struggled, the more entangled he became in the cold silt and weeds. It pulled him deeper, and he struggled to catch his breath, only to suck in nearly frozen silt-stirred water. He fought to climb back to the top. His eyes could see the dim light through the murky water. His face and mouth just inches away, but it may as well have been hundreds of feet. His strength could no longer find any fight, and he refused to loosen his grip of Emily Sue in his attempts to keep her above the surface. His mind wouldn't let him acknowledge she was already long gone. All his brain would do was sacrifice to save her, his one love that had finally become real. Up on top of the hill, behind several trees, sat the devil himself, deep inset eyes, cold of death and destruction, staring with intensity at Tilper's struggle below as he was being swallowed up by death. Rodney had died several months before. Hate and jealousy was his demon he had succumbed to. He had watched his chance at fame die quickly when the better half of talent he shared suffered the horrible, debilitating injury from a pass he had thrown so poorly. It had been a miracle Tilper had even caught it, unfortunately at the price of stretching out far enough to catch it that his maneuver left him wide open to the harsh tackle that took him out of the game. Rodney knew deep down that his pass had been the cause and fall of the team's winning streak and loss of his once best friend and teammate. His psyche wouldn't allow him to accept that fact, so he sought to place blame and cause destruction to his friend. He tried to hurt him as repayment by stealing the only girl Tilper ever loved. Rodney couldn't give up his vengefulness after never repeating any football success, even years after moving away and joining the army. His misguided hate followed him through drugs and booze, and finally a deal made with the devil. A deal he wasn't even able to do more than orchestrate. The devil wouldn't allow him to watch his final deed. Just another price to pay for hell. The devil was enjoying it, though. He wanted little innocent Tilper from day one. Emily Sue was just collateral damage. The devil's eyes glowed at the sight they took in. Christmas. Ah! He hissed. The devil was so busy relishing in his cruelness that he never saw the beast coming, never heard its run through the buffeting snow, the cold layer that killed any sound of what was about to hit. Wheeler plunged forward, paws outward in the air as he flew the last few feet, his jaws wide open and sharp fangs digging into Satan's laughing throat. Silence had filled the pond where Tilper and Emily Sue now rested below the surface, cold and rigid. Death had swallowed up Tilper's and Emily Sue's Christmas love and future. Wheeler's jaws, though, held tight as he and the devil rolled down the hillside, tumbling with hideous screams from hell until they spilled into the cold water's edge of the drowning pond to the sizzling hisses of a demon's instant death. To this day, some people say if you quietly walk down to Tilper's pond on a snowy Christmas day, you'll see Tilper and Emily Sue holding hands, sitting on the old rustic bench, and hear beautiful chilling sounds emanating through the trees from his handmade violin gift given on that one extraordinary snowy Christmas Eve. Several feet down the shore by the spot where Tilper drowned, at the water's edge, still sits Wheeler, his blue-gray pit bull mix, patiently waiting, eyes fixed on the water's surface for his master to reappear and come home.
It was everything about the sea that had always unnerved him, waiting at the bottom in one cold, disintegrating hulk. Not 2 minutes earlier, Danny was in another world, the world above the waves, the world of air and land and the hot, dry feel of the summer sun. His wetsuit snug as a second skin, he sat on the cuddy boat's transom long enough to velcro a lanyard around his ankle, binding him to the safety line with 90 feet of slack. He cinched tight his goggles, round and insectoid, then slipped over the stern. Bobbing in sync with the hull, he sucked wind and huffed it out, cycling a few times before filling from the bottom up, belly, lower chest, upper chest, like trying to cram a stuffed suitcase with more and a little more on top of that. In the boat, against the lone cloud in the sky, Chemo held a stopwatch with his thumb on the trigger. Ready? Danny squeezed in one last sip of air and plunged head first, like a seal, full body undulations propelling him down, with the safety line trailing after. The swim fins helped. He'd not been blessed with big feet. They never made fun in Hawaii, but guys always made fun here on the mainland. Hey, Danny, with those dainty little Asian paws of yours, how do you manage to even stay up on a surfboard? Well, maybe they didn't mean anything by it. Or maybe they did, trying to get inside his head, psych him out. Small feet. Small. Yeah. He converted it to fuel. That much more drive to bring home a trophy, another sponsorship. But all that was a world away. He was in the blue world now, a gradient of cerulean to indigo yawning beneath him, where the farther down you went, the more the topside laws unraveled. Until he'd first experienced the shift for himself back in the spring, he had always believed the same as everyone else he brought it up with, that freediving was a non-stop struggle against your own buoyancy, fighting the lift of the air heaved into your lungs. Another misconception dies hard. It was like that for only the first 40 or so feet down. Make it that far, to what they called the doorway to the deep, and there came a transition he had yet to stop regarding with wonder. Buoyancy was neutralized, the weight of the water bearing down, nullifying your tendency to rise to the surface. No more struggle. The fight was won. The sea had you then, a downward pull he could feel tugging on his shoulders and skull. He held his arms along his sides, aquadynamic, and continued to descend, effortlessly now, like a skydiver, bulleting in freefall. The trickiest part had been learning how to equalize the pressure on his ears, in his sinuses, and turn back the pain. The deeper he sank, the more the pressure became like the slow tightening of a fist that would never relax. It had taken some reframing of the changes it made, seeing them as comforting rather than distressing. This is what happens down here. This is normal. Another version of normal. No big deal. Just the mammalian dive reflex. Shifts of physiology so distinct, so foreign out of the water, so automatic in it. They could recalibrate a lifetime of thinking after a dive or two. Maybe we really do belong here. Despite the exertion, his heart rate slowed. Even before the threshold 40 feet down, his lungs were already compressed to half their normal size. At 60, they were reduced to a third. If he were acclimated enough to go that far, at 300 feet, his lungs would be no bigger than baseballs. Here, though, a couple miles out to sea, over a shelf of land jutting from the central Oregon coast, the bottom cut him off at a depth of 76. Almost there. He tucked into a ball and flipped head over tail, to finish dropping flippers first. He tucked down with a gentle bounce that stirred the silt amid a sparse garden of kelp and seaweed that swayed in the current. And all was so very quiet. Like awakening to a dream world of slow time and profound tranquility. The need to breathe remained on some far horizon. The pressure was a cocoon, a presence as welcoming as a hug. All this time he'd been lying to himself, thinking he knew something about the ocean. And why? Because he'd grown up on an island? Because he'd first stepped onto a surfboard when he was 7 and had hardly stepped off since? That was how you fooled yourself into believing you truly understood the sea when all you'd ever done on a board was scratch the water's surface. Above, the day was clear, bright and sunny. Down here, the sun still found him, but was filtered to a murky twilight, as if the fog of morning and blue of evening had joined, to wrap around and welcome him home. It took slow moments to take shape. A mass off to his left, a ragged, edgeless hill rising from the sea floor. Danny moved toward it in fin-encumbered hops, a feeling maybe like walking on the moon. He hadn't gotten close enough to satisfy his curiosity before his tether to the surface ran out of slack. The dumbest thing in the world would be to strip the lanyard from his ankle. He did it anyway, fearing if he didn't get close enough for a look now, he might never find the spot again. He left the safety line behind and was truly diving free. The mass was no longer edgeless, and no hill. A hill wouldn't have 2 masts jutting down from one side to dig into the sea floor. A hill wouldn't have rectangular openings, nor broken windows, metal railings, cleats still wrapped with decaying rope. It was somebody's lost sailing yacht, a 50-footer at minimum, resting on its starboard side. The build was old school, lots of wood where most buyers would have been content with aluminum and fiberglass. Now,
It was an ecosystem, submerged long enough to have sagged into itself and crushed over with rot and life. The cold found him through his wetsuit and went for his marrow. Shipwrecks had always bothered him, even from the safety of pictures. Planes lost at sea, too, and sunken cars, and houses and timber groves and valleys flooded to make new lakes. It was more than the tragedies and calamities they told of. It was their status, things perfectly normal in the topside world. Aliens now, lost and alone, where they were never meant to be. They were a rebuttal. You're lying to yourself, you know? It's the hypoxia talking. You think you belong. This isn't your element at all. Regardless, the wreck drew him in until he was close enough to touch it. Everything down here is so much better suited to belong than you. Here, all you are is a resource. Breathing? Soon. The pent-up need, he now understood, wasn't driven by a lack of oxygen. The body had no sensors for that. An amazing oversight. Nobody would ever design an oxygen-powered machine that way on purpose. Down here, your food. All you have to do is wait. Instead, the clawing need to breathe came from a buildup of carbon dioxide, and you could hack that to a degree. He let a poof of stale air slip his lips, and it bought him a little more time. He squatted and gripped the yacht's tilted gunwale to shove off it and launch his ascent. But to his surprise, it gave way with a muffled crunch, and a cloud of debris, crumbs and shards of rotten wood drifting loose. It was what was inside that really gave him a jolt. The cross-section of wood appeared tunneled, the burrows full of soft, pale bodies. Worms, they looked like. Some as short and thin as matches, others the size of a finger, one as plump as a cigar. Danny vented more CO2, this time not meaning to, a sound of disgust burping loose, and he'd been down too long, his vision starting to close around the edges with the height of a 7-story building left to swim. He pushed off the bottom and kicked toward the beckoning daylight. If your vision began turning to a haze they called the pink cloud, that was when you really had to worry. What came next was a blackout, and he feared it was moments away. The resetting of the clock to a final countdown. You could drift unconscious for a couple minutes, no harm done, your larynx automatically closing like a valve to keep the water out. Up top, they would know before it opened again, if they were paying attention. You just had to trust your team. They'd realize you were in trouble, haul you up by your safety line. Oh. Right, shit. He kicked harder. Which came first then? The movement out in front of him? Or the movement he felt through him? Through, probably. Yeah, go with that. His insides felt stirred, quivering as if he'd hugged a vibrator. Right away he knew what it was. He'd felt the same thing from dolphins. Echolocation. A ping of sonar developed over millions of years of evolution. So advanced it made the Navy's best look like a toy. But this was no dolphin. If a dolphin was a whisper, what he'd felt was a bark. He lowered his gaze from the beacon of the sun and back to the deep blue haze. 20, 30 yards out it was dimly visible, a darker bulk against the murk, a slick, bulbous head and a body stretching too far back into the gloom to make out. With his vision closing down, Danny could barely see it anyway, and only for a moment before it faded into a wash of pink. He heard a muffled thump and the sensation enveloped him again. If you're lucky and you know it, clap your hands. Whatever was out there could have obliterated him without trying. Sperm whales? Loudest animals on Earth. Their clicks could be so loud they couldn't even exist in the air as sound. They could blow out your eardrums, maybe kill you as surely as the concussive blast of a bomb. Lucky, it was only scanning, giving him a sonogram. Kicking again with legs starting to feel like tingling rubber, nearly blind now, he rose toward a total eclipse of the sun. A few feet from the surface, he spewed a gush of bubbles to empty his aching lungs. Then, with a titanic whoosh, broke through into the glorious air. "You stupid motherfucker!" Kimo was peering down from the boat as if he were looking at a ghost. Things started going clear again, even the sweat spraying from Kimo's shaved head as he whipped the lanyard at the end of the rope, like shaking a leash at a naughty dog. "What is this? What the fuck is this?" My bad? Didn't quite cut it under the circumstances, did it? What? Almost drowning once this year wasn't enough for you? You thought you'd find another way? Treading water, Danny peeled off his goggles and flipped his hair back from his face to splat against his shoulders. "Sorry, man. I needed more than 90 feet. But you stopped moving." Kimo jabbed a finger toward the sonar screen. "It still makes you dumb as a rock, but if you kept moving, you wouldn't have sent me from zero to panic mode, hauling this up, and you're not on the end of it anymore." He flung the safety line to the deck. "I was 2 seconds from going in after you." "But I started moving again. Obviously, you didn't see that? I'm giving myself 90 feet of rope burns. No, I don't multitask." The man had been looking out for him for years, one displaced Hawaiian to another, and his anger was so pure, so righteous, so Kimo, Danny couldn't help but laugh. It was the right thing at the right time, same as below, the body knowing what to do, and doing it. "I was fine, really." He took Kimo's hand and clambered over the side into the boat, then tapped the sonar. "How about the whale? You see the whale?" For a moment, Kimo could only blink. Translation? "Good going, asshole. Now you made me miss an entire whale, too." "You saw a whale?" "Just for a second or two. My vision was going, so..." "Are you sure you weren't hallucinating?" "I felt him check me out. I didn't hallucinate that." He turned a clumsy 360 to scan the waves for a breach, but saw nothing. "How long was I down?" I think you were around 245. 250 when I went for the line. I don't even know where the watch landed." Danny plopped onto the transom and wriggled out of his fins. "So I had to break 3 minutes, easy. Nothing impressive by competition standards. Competitive freedivers could rack up depths and times that were off the chain. But those people were all about the numbers. The endurance. Not about merging with the sea. A new personal best and I don't even know what it is." He tossed his fins aside, then spotted the stopwatch beside their cooler of water bottles. He snatched it up and held it toward Kimo's face. Back to normal brown after all the furious brick red. "Check it," Danny said. 6:34 and counting. Kimo rolled his eyes. "That'll look good on your tombstone. Still holding my breath, bitches." Shipworms. That's all you saw when the wood came apart. Gale told him that afternoon. They're called shipworms. Danny didn't know whether to be fascinated or appalled. A whale? He could wrap his brain around that. Those aquatic grubs were something new. Shipworms? It's actually a thing? For someone who's eaten as many waves as you have, your sense of maritime history really is lacking. She gave him a peck on the cheek, as if to say she loved him anyway. Yeah, they're a thing. In the age of sailing ships before steel hulls, they were a big, bad, serious thing. Termites of the sea is the best way to describe them. If they weren't busy eating shipwrecks, they were causing them, or chewing through wharves, piers, anything like that, waiting for a nice juicy log to drift by to turn into a floating condo. Your home is your food, pretty much the definition of a parasite. Like taking a gander around this cliff-top cottage and thinking, hey, break me off a piece of that wall. I'm feeling peckish. What am I in the mood for? The green room? The blue room? Something in the line of a honey gold breakfast nook. Yum. But they're not actually worms. They're mollusks, like long skinny oysters. They've got little shells on the front. That's how they burrow in. She perked up. If you dive that wreck again, bring up a few. They're supposed to taste like clams. That's a bucket of nope right there. His stomach did barrel rolls at the thought. How do you know this? You don't even sail. That was the distinction between them. For all her astonishing symbiosis with the sea, Gale hardly ever got out on it. That was his department. Gale was perfectly happy being its next-door neighbor. She crossed her arms and, with a cockeyed grin, withered him with a glance. He knew how to translate that look. "Come with me, you fool." With a swirl of her skirt, she led him out of the cottage and across the stone path to the outbuilding. Her workshop, bright and airy and open to clear out the smell of varnish. Its walls were the color of sea foam. Its windows faced a panoramic view of the Pacific. And it was always full of driftwood. Most of the pieces were still raw, just as they had been harvested from the beach. The rest were in various stages of processing and transformation. Every chunk she brought in was its own starter kit. Anything from simple projects like necklace racks to elaborate constructions like lampstands and chandeliers that she sold to galleries from Portland to Santa Barbara. Last year, she'd taken hundreds of seemingly useless fragments and, or anyone else might have seen only kindling, turned them into a mosaic of a whimsical octopus with spiral seashells for eyes. Gale snatched up a sun-bleached branch the length of his arm, peppered with perforations as if someone had used it for target practice. "After almost 20 years of seeing me do this, you never wondered where these holes come from." I guess I thought it was weathering. By her skeptical look, she wasn't buying it. "Okay, I guess I never thought about it at all." She gave him one of those shakes of her head, playful but dismissive, that left him feeling she had so much more wisdom than he did, baked in from birth. "If it doesn't eat the surfboard out from under you, it doesn't exist, right?" Pretty much," he conceded. As a rule, ignorance was no virtue, but if you gave too much thought to the sea, and everything with teeth and called it home, you'd never venture out to meet it. Maybe that was why she stayed on shore. They grilled on the patio that evening, marinated tempeh and vegetables, and as they usually did unless the rain had other ideas, carried their plates out to the wrought iron table on the little redwood deck so they could eat beneath the sky, facing the sea. The cottage was one of a haphazard nest of 6, perched near the edge of a 200-foot cliff, overlooking the beach and breakers below. Bellies full, they kicked their feet up on the brick retaining wall around the fire pit and passed the evening's joint back and forth. Danny wanted to say he liked it better living at the condo in Santa Monica, and Gale liked it better here, but that wasn't true. Santa Monica was only more convenient. He liked it better here too. Time passed differently here, the days longer, the seasons more pronounced. On the luckiest nights, he might awaken to the faraway squeal of a passing whale. Humpback, he supposed. The only kind he was aware of whose songs carried above water. He would roll over to find that Gale was already up, her silhouette framed by the bedroom window, where she sat as still as stone and listened for as long as it would last. They never got that in Santa Monica. Although she was never farther away from him than she was in those minutes, lost inside a trance, and there was little he could do to get her back but wait. Anyway, that with it, he'd been meaning to bring it up for months. Now, felt as right as ever. "I'm gonna have to find a business to go into, or invent." Telling the water, but for Gale's ears. "Any suggestions?" She looked more concerned with diagnosing causes. "Is it the fear?" Well, that wasn't it, but it made sense she would go there. They'd have to give the topic a couple of airings after his wipeout this spring at Preveley Park. The bigger the wave, the more ways a ride could go wrong. Miscalculations, human error, the never-predictable hydraulics of any given wave. However it happened, things went wrong. While you went shooting through the tube, the board got sucked up the wall of water curling over behind you, or the wave rose up while the bottom dropped out, and you got slammed into the impact zone. You were no longer riding the wave. It was riding you, maybe grinding you into the sand and rocks that really teach you a lesson. He knew no greater helplessness than that. Being held under by the first wave was terror enough. If you were still down when the next one came crashing in, you felt exponentially worse, battered and exhausted and desperate to breathe. Still hadn't surfaced before a third one came along. That was when it seemed as though the ocean had made up its unfathomable mind. It wasn't letting go. He'd known a couple guys who hadn't come up alive, but he had. No idea how, but after a 3-wave holedown at Preveley Park, he had. The ocean doesn't want me today. It was as good an explanation as any. But one day it might. It was the reason he'd taken up freediving, to extend his breath-holding duration, to get comfortable with being under the water a long time, because as a surfer, under was the last place anyone wanted to be. And it had helped. He felt recalibrated, more at peace with under than ever. So no, this had nothing to do with fear. It's worse, he said. It's the calendar and the numbers. Gale had been holding back a toke and lost it with a hacking laugh. I thought it would be at least another 20 years before maybe I'd hear you make a concession there. She fixed him with a hazy leer. Who are you, foul thing that crawled from the sea? And give me back my Danny. Which version? He was developing a nostalgic longing for the Danny Yukimura who seemed incapable of thinking about consequences. Gale rubbed his arm. It's just another birthday with a 0. Don't you know? 40 is the new 18. I think is what it's down to. Well, that only helps if 18 is the new as yet unborn. He took the joint, made it smolder, handed it back. It's the rankings. In the top 30 in the world, I've had a good run. But I'd never gotten higher than 22, and now I'm right back on the edge. The only place to go is down. That's how this goes. Especially now. It was the times. Thrilling to be around to witness them, but shitty when you were a casualty because you couldn't keep up. People were out there doing amazing things, unthinkable things, feats that had been considered impossible. There's something changing in the world. He traced it back to when Laird Hamilton had caught that millennium wave, Intir Hupwo. Until then, nobody had ridden a 60-foot wave. Nobody. It wasn't merely the height, it was the length, the girth, the colossal magnitude. Even Hamilton hadn't been planning on it. He got towed into the wave. Then it rose a behemoth. As the tube collapsed behind him, everybody watching thought he was dead, until he came shooting up out of the spray. A thing like that did something magical. It opened a doorway to unknown realms of potential. 80-footers, 90-footers. Guys were riding them now. It wasn't only surfers either. Skateboarders, skiers, snowboarders, superhumans were popping up everywhere. Somebody does something that blows minds around the globe and everyone says, "Damn, dude, that record's gonna stand for years." Then it doesn't even stand a season. Something in the air, maybe. Something in the water. He loved seeing it unfold in the world. It was a beautiful time to be alive. But it wasn't his arena anymore. He couldn't compete with that. Go big or go home. He was home. He just had no idea what to do next. So you launch your own line of boards or gear or both, Yale said. Or you open up the Danny Yukamura School of Surfing and turn into one of those cute old guys with the long white hair and wispy beard, but still badass, and wait for people to come to you. Because they will. He wanted to believe. Gale made it easy to believe. Even if he still ached for more, and had no idea what it was. Before the dawn, even before coffee, they made their way along the stairs that zigzagged down a cleft in the land from cliff top to sea level. The wooden steps were perpetually damp, even in summer, crowded over by trees so that the sun never reached them. They nearly always had the shore to themselves when beach walking this early, sharing it with at most a neighbor from above, out with a dog and a stick. He knew of no place where dawn was more different from dusk than here, with the sun on the other side of the continent, behind a 200-foot wall of rock and earth. Here, dawns were gradual and gray, a time of mist and fog. This morning, the wind was up, sending ribbons of fine, dry sand skimming over the damp, packed plains of the beach. The surf rolled and pounded behind a veil, as if the sand were of one world and the water of another, and every sunrise it took the proper spell to bring them back together. They wouldn't be going home empty-handed. They never did. The only variable was what Gale would find, and how long it would take after she shook his hand and went on the hunt. He'd never met anyone more suited to spend her life seaside, not merely to live here, but thrive. She smelled of the sea, tasted of it. Even the ocean knew its own. The sea had recognized this about her as soon as Gale arrived for good, a couple years before they'd met. She had grown up Midwestern, landlocked in every direction, but the farthest shores had always called her from as early a time as she could remember. A week after her 18th birthday, she made the 1,500-mile trek west, one way this time. A week after that, one morning's beach walk set her up for years, when she came upon what appeared to be a peculiar yellowish rock, stone-like, yet waxy, embedded in the sand. Right away, she'd known it for what it really was: ambergris, a solidified lump of secretions from the belly of a sperm whale, nearly 3 pounds of it. No substance on earth was more prized by the makers of perfume, especially in France. It was illegal to sell in the States, though, so one impromptu trip to Canada later, she returned 3 pounds lighter, $140,000 heavier, and after making the down payment on the cottage, had hardly left the ocean side ever since. Such a find had to be more than dumb luck. Yale had taken it not merely as a welcome, but as a blessing. You're where you belong now. This is your home. It's always been your home. You just had to find your way back. The sea never stopped giving to her. Danny had never seen anything like it, the sheer reliability of it. Some days the swells didn't want to be surfed, and you had to accept that. But Gale and her walks along the shore, harvesting the ocean's cast-offs, she always came back with something, and the desires to see what she could make of it sent her out beachcombing with 10 other people, and there was a good chance she'd come back with more treasure than everyone else combined. He imagined salt-encrusted nymphs out in the surf, working on her behalf. Look alive, mateys. It's her again. Heave to. This morning, the farther north they walked, the lighter the dawn became, as ahead of them, Neptune's throne took shape out of the gray haze. Neptune's throne was all he'd ever heard anyone call it. It was an observation platform for surfers to watch the incoming, but whoever had built it hadn't made it particularly convenient. It was 4 solid tree trunk pillars driven deep into the sand, braced with crossbeams and supporting a planked deck just above head height. No steps. If you wanted to clamber onto it, you had to have either the upper body strength to pull yourself up, or friends to push you from below. It had a back like a gargantuan chair, a windbreak, he assumed, blocking what the cliffs didn't. 2 of the trunks joined above the platform with an X, which in turn supported a row of ragged planks that were shortest on the outside and rose to an imperial peak in the middle. The deck was usually thatched, and at first glance the bristly edges gave it the look of something that belonged somewhere tropical. Kimo recalled more of Hawaii than he did, and said the thing reminded him of rough-hewn structures he'd seen in places tourists didn't get to, burial platforms, and shrines where fishermen laid offerings to the gods of the sea before heading out, or after rowing back in with their catch. Keep looking at it, though, and the tropical impression faded, darkened. Danny wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way the 2 front trunks topped out with the flare stumps of long-gone limbs as thick as the trunks themselves. Neither appeared shaped by hand, only weathered, yet each had the look of a skull that faced the sea, like the bones of a pair of malformed whales. Who had first built the thing and when? Questions no one could answer. If their neighbor Felicia was to be believed, Neptune's throne was older than he was, and her as well. Felicia had lived atop the cliff for 50 years and claimed the structure was there when she and her husband moved in. Claimed as well she'd seen a photo dated decades earlier from the time of the Great Depression, and it was standing then too. Meaning none of today's throne could have been the original wood. It was too well maintained to have withstood over 80 years of weathering. But in the years he and Gail had been dividing their time between here and Santa Monica, he'd never seen anyone repair it, only use it. When they passed by, Gail patted one of the gray-weathered anchor posts as if it were the leg of a friendly elephant. He lingered, fingertips tracing the little holes along the wood. He knew what they were now, but wasn't pleased about that, as if there were a chance he could probe far enough inside to find a tangle of worms that had learned how to live outside the sea. In their present direction, north, they were nearing their terminus, where a point of land fit for a lighthouse curved around from the right and speared out into the waves. At the base of the wall ran a stream fed by tributaries that trickled down the hillsides, then joined and cut ever-changing channels in the sand before emptying into the sea. It was here she found it, a still wet chunk of driftwood the size of a truncated log, mired in the sand of a delta that might not be here tomorrow morning, erased by the tide and recut somewhere else. Gail knelt. She scraped off sand and picked away rags of seaweed. "You want to do the honors, my strong guy?" Danny wrestled it free of the beach's hold and stood it on end. It was lighter than it looked, would be lighter still after it dried. Regardless, he didn't relish the thought of lugging it 200 feet up slick wooden stairs. "Wow," she said after she had a longer look. "If I didn't know better, and maybe I don't, I'd say this was something that had already been carved." They traded places, Gail holding it up while he stepped back for a view. She was right. It had a suggestion of form. Human, or maybe he was biased that way. Still, working with the contours and curves of what remained, he could discern legs pressed together and thickening into hips, a waist and sloping shoulders, a head. It would be unrecognizable without a head. The figurehead of a ship's prow, maybe? He recalled yesterday's yacht, being gnawed to slivers on the ocean floor. Maybe not that boat in particular, a straight chunk of someone else's bad luck. The ocean was forever digesting the remains of bad luck and coughing up the pieces. A lot of figureheads were big-breasted women, traditionally speaking. Beside it, Gail went ramrod straight and perked up her chest, comparing. "If I squint just right, I can make out a couple boobs." She looked him in the eye, squinty. "And if you say, 'But what about the wood?' I will murder you in your sleep." She had him call heads or tails. Then they took their places at either end and began to shuffle the thing home. 2 days later, she found another one washed up half a mile to the south. Longer by a few inches, but shaped almost identically. 2 half-rotted figureheads on the same beach at the same time? Not likely. By now, he was leaning toward dismissing it as a case of pareidolia, the tendency to see ships in clouds, the man in the moon, and Jesus on a burnt tortilla, or making a face out of 2 holes, a bump, and a line. Even so, lugging them home felt like carrying corpses, complete with grave worms. The sodden outer wood sloughed and squished in its uncertain grip. Halfway up the cliff with the second one, his fingers broke through as if piercing a crust, and pulped an embedded shipworm as thick as a sausage. He nearly dropped the log and went down with it. The stairs were damp underfoot and slick with wet flora, treacherous for carrying this kind of load. When Gail found the third one a few days later, he had no idea what to make of it. If pareidolia was simple pattern recognition, okay then, what sort of pattern was this? On the surface, it seemed the same old relationship Gail had always had with the sea and the generosity of its tides. but it had never given her the same exact thing time after time. If it was going to do that, why not be really generous and keep lobbing more lumps of ambergris at her? She first left her finds outside on heavy racks to dry in the July sun, turning them every few hours like hot dogs in a grill. Then, she moved them into her workshop, lined them against one wall, standing in a row. They turned pale now that they were dry, bleached by the elements and time. With the muck wiped off and the water bloat gone, finer details emerged. The pieces all tapered and thickened the same way, with dual concavities that suggested eyes, and a nub that suggested a nose, and a crack against the grain for a mouth. They were just humanoid enough that Danny didn't like turning his back on them, as if they were shells that would break open and release some worse form gestating inside. Gotta be a simple explanation, Chemo told him on the boat while out on another free-diving trip. Maybe there's something that fell off a cargo ship. Some shipment of carvings that weren't very good to begin with. Or there's some asshole out here who lives on a boat, thinks he's an artist, more money than talent, and dumps his mistakes overboard when nothing turns out the way he wants. Whatever they are, not that they're washing up, they look that much worse. Incompetent artists, Danny said. Really? That's your explanation? If you had a better one, you wouldn't have asked me what I thought. Point taken. But the wobble in this theory was that nothing about any of these pieces appeared to have been carved. Danny had looked, then closely. No evidence of chisels, rasps, scrapers, draw knives. They showed no signs of hand tooling at all. Even the ends looked broken, not sawed. What was the likelihood that someone who couldn't turn out a carving that looked more than vaguely human was, nevertheless, skilled enough to keep everything smooth, free of facets? Erosion, where? Chemo said. You ever see a jagged stone in a riverbed? Not me. Pick any rock. You don't know how it looked when it went in. You're just getting what's left. And when Gale found another, number 4, but it was counting, Danny wasn't even surprised. Well, yes, he was, not by the find, but by the irritation he felt at the news. How many of these things did she need anyway? Just because they washed up, did that obligate her to accept every single one? Bring them all home? It wasn't like him to be resentful. But analyze it anyway. Things hadn't merely come easily for Gale. They came effortlessly. The ocean gave, and never ran out. All she had to do was show up and take possession. He'd be lucky to be able to make a decent living doing something he loved, but it had never come easily. It had taken thousands of hours of wave time to hone his skills. It had taken near drownings, lacerations from coral, jellyfish stings, reef rash, a staph infection, various sprains, 2 separate concussions when the board smacked him in the head. And that was before factoring in every competitor on the tour as breathing down his neck, eager to take his ranking and sponsorships for themselves. Worst of all, it was life with an expiration date. He couldn't keep doing it forever, and he was nearly there. He could feel the downward pull as surely as he felt it during a dive, after entering the doorway to the deep. Gale, though, went on as ever, bringing up trinkets as though she were being wooed by the same sea that she claimed to love, but wouldn't go out on, not even with him. As she began to spend more hours in her workshop than ever, he wondered if it was karmic payback. If this was what it had been like for her over 2 decades, forced to share him with a passion that consumed him, sent him around the world to wherever the waves were at their biggest and baddest. From Mavericks to Waimea Bay, from Tavarua to Padong. Maybe that was the part that hadn't come easily for her. But by the time the 5th figure turned up, even Gale seemed past taking any joy in it. Something about this was not right. It had never been quite right. This feels like a cat sometimes, bringing you its kills, she confessed in the workshop one evening. At the bank of windows, the sun dropped boiling red into the cauldron of the sea. It loves you, but it's love on a whole different wavelength. He had no idea what to say to that. Along the north wall, the carvings seemed to be daring him to try. He was beginning to hate them. Whatever secret they knew, they weren't telling. At the center of the shop, a rectangular work table, as stout and sturdy as a stage, held half a dozen pieces of driftwood in various stages of transformation. Sculptures and a bonsai planter, none of which had progressed in 3 days. All Gale did now was come out and sit with them, seemingly stymied by the new arrivals that were piling up, as if they'd come to tell her that her work was at an end. Her methods hadn't changed in all the time he'd loved her, across 19 years of being together, 17 of marriage. Each piece of driftwood she harvested merited its own staring contest, a still, silent interrogation during which she divined what it wanted to be, needed to be, in its new and resurrected life. But these unblinking humanoids, Gale was treating them as if they were complete already, and no need of refinement. They didn't seem to be going anywhere. Like her, they were home. "You know, we've done the seaside thing for more than half of our lives," he said. "If I'll be retiring soon anyway, maybe we should give mountains a try." She almost laughed. "Lie awake at night listening for elk? I don't know if that would work or not." She turned at the window and faced the rolling waters. He followed her gaze in case there was something to see, but if there was, only Gale could see it. "Did you ever hear about the 52 Hertz whale?" she said. He had not. "It's the saddest thing ever. Researchers have been picking it up on hydrophones for years. It's only ever been heard, never seen." She was facing the window as if telling the ocean, and he was just around to eavesdrop. "This whale, this one single whale that sings at a higher frequency than all the others, 52 hertz. All the usual suspects, blue whales, fin whales like that, they're down around 15 or 20 or 30. So nobody ever knows what kind of whale this is. All they know is that it just keeps roaming the Pacific, calling out, singing its song, and nothing else is answering." She turned her back to the window, facing him again. "Better keep your mountains. I don't think I could handle that with an elk. They'll come right up in your front yard." He left her to it, all of it, the worm-eaten pieces of wood and the stalled magic she wielded over them, and traded the workshop for twilight. Out here on the grass, the 5th refugee carving remained wedged in its drying rack. Horizontal, it looked helpless. As he stepped closer, Danny wondered how she would react if he dragged it toward the setting sun and threw it off the cliff. He hadn't given this one a second look since it was cleaned off and mostly dry. What would have been the point? They were all the same, more or less. Except this one wasn't. He dared to touch it, to run his hand over what had been obscured before and was still barely visible. A faint impression scored around it, near the bottom end, like the groove of a finger after taking off a wedding ring, tattooed with a trace of rust. No way, he thought. This whole time, assuming these had started out as ordinary logs, when they were nothing of the sort. No way. The great thing about Chemo was that there was almost nothing he wouldn't drop at a moment's notice to take his boat out. He'd saved the GPS coordinates of the sunken yacht, so even after 3 weeks it was easy to find again. Once Danny was in the water, Chemo waved the coil of rope before tossing it over the side. "I'm giving you a longer leash, so leave it on. If you touch the lanyard this time, I'm going to break your arm." "Yes, Mom." Danny huffed wind to saturate himself, filled up, locked it in, then ducked and plunged. By now he'd been trading his frogman flippers for a monofin. Chemo called it his mermaid ass. It fit over both feet and forced his legs to move together, scything the water like a whale's flukes to turbocharge each kick. It made the hardest part of the dive easier, if no faster. He could equalize the pressure in his head only so quickly, but it took less energy to power downward, dolphin kicking, and to maneuver around once he got below neutral buoyancy, and that was what mattered. 76 feet down, the wreck waited in the hushed indigo haze. still tipped onto its starboard side with its mast jutting down into the ooze. And if the boat still unnerved him, helpless, disintegrating in a grave of silt and mud, it was at least familiar now. He knew it was pointless to check the prow for a figurehead, but felt compelled to do it anyway. And, of course, there was no evidence of one ever having been there. He turned onto his side and swam parallel to the sea floor, really mermaiding it now, cruising the length of the deck from bow to stern, inspecting the damage and the rot. He was gliding back the opposite way when it struck him. He'd been so focused on the small details that he had missed the big, obvious one right in front of him. He'd been looking for a hole ripped in the deck, or a broken stump, evidence of a missing mast. He'd been looking over what remained for signs of mast hoops, iron reinforcements especially, that might have chafed a groove of rust and wear around the bottom of its mast in the push and pull of the currents. And they were there. It was only when he took in the big picture that he realized, 3 weeks ago, the wreck had 2 masts, angled down toward the sediment. Now there was only one, the foremast. There appeared to have been 3 in total, masts detached from wrecked ships. Sure, it happened. But where were they now? No telling how long the rearward mizzen had been gone, but within the past 22 days, the mainmast shouldn't have gotten far. Shouldn't, but had. He feared he could guess where the 30+ feet of them might have ended up. Where, but not how. There was no how he could imagine. There was no how he wanted to imagine. There was only his quickening heart and the hunger to breathe and the air above the waves. He surfaced and plunged again, like a pearl diver looking for a prize too big to be misplaced. He widened his search to the limits of his safety line, and still, it wasn't enough. Looking out toward deeper waters, beyond the spot where he caught that glimpse of the whale emerging through the dim blue, he saw how the seafloor sloped away, and that down the incline some indistinct patch of shadow waited. A trick of the light would waver. This didn't waver. "We need to move," he told Chemo the next time he surfaced. 40 or 50 yards that way. Never thought he'd see Chemo balk at piloting the boat. "Dude, you've had a month of downtime since the Corona Open. Is this really how you want to spend your final days of it? Instead of getting your mind on the Billabong Pro?" Treading water, spitting salt. "Yeah, it is. It helps. Everything helps. What's so special about 50 yards that way? Because I'm ready for it." Chemo made the move, grumbling, but insisted on doing a sonar reading of the bottom. 94 feet. Danny had never dived that far. Not a huge leap from last week's new personal best of 83. But still, it meant more pressure and another 22 feet of round trip. This was not insignificant. He went anyway. Deeper, bluer, colder, darker. He relaxed into the squeeze, welcoming it like an embrace. From above and to the side, he couldn't yet tell what was waiting below. Submerged another 18 feet lower than the yacht, even less light reached his target zone. But it was more than that. The water looked cloudier here, too. As his vision acclimated to the gloom, he could make out what appeared to be a slab on the sea floor, 3 times the width of a car, furred with growth, and set in the midst of a forest of bull kelp. Their stalks swayed in the currents with their fronds wavering like pennants in a breeze. The further he sank, and the closer he drifted, the less natural the slab looked. Like a mound of sand and mud and stones, scraped into a heap and packed together with intent. For no reason he wanted to explore, its flatness and order, its look of purpose, reminded him of the work table in Gale's shop. Again he was overcome with the uneasy sense of facing something out of place, lost from above, and drowned without pity. Because rising from the mound was a grove of logs, 8 of them, seemingly jammed into the muck to hold them in place. Their tops were ragged, splintered, a sight that nearly locked his mind. He could imagine no force in the sea that could take a ship's mast and break it up this orderly way, or would even want to. Around each piece, a thrashing cloud of motion churned and blurred the water. By now he knew a shipworm on sight. Even at their most normal, they still filled him with loathing. But he didn't think they were supposed to behave like this. Hundreds of them visible, like hagfish, burrowed into the side of a decomposing whale. They streamed over the wood with the furious energy of a feeding frenzy. The dread crept in cold from the outer dark. This was something no one was meant to see. Ever. A hiker would feel this way stumbling across the half-eaten carcass of a mule deer, then smelling the musk and carrion scent of the returning grizzly. Danny flicked his fin to drift close enough to see the hard little shells on the worms' heads, scoring the wood, shaping it as surely as rasps and chisels and lathes. He recognized the human form gnawed free from the lengths of mast. Anyone would. He knew their contours. He logged their predecessors up on the beach 5 times already. And among the 3 that appeared farthest along, he recognized the face, taking shape out of the grain. He had loved it for the past 19 years. Danny tried to will the sight away as an illusion born of low light and a brain hungry for oxygen, but it wouldn't resolve into anything else. He pinched off a half-dozen of the worms, fat and lashing, and flung them to the silt so he could caress his hand along the fresh-carved visage. Even blind, in the dark of an infinite abyss, he would know that cheekbone, that nose, that jawline, that hollow at the throat. Already the worms he'd dropped were wriggling back up to her face to dig back in and resume their tasks. Mindless, they seemed to obey a directive he couldn't begin to fathom. But if something out here was capable of snapping a ship's mast into pieces like a pencil, then maybe it followed that it had workers. Drones subjugated by the kind of group mind that turned a school of fish in perfect unison. There was no why he wanted to imagine either. 5 above, 8 down here, and who knew how many more might be drifting unfinished somewhere between. In revulsion, in the grip of something he felt but could not name, he gave the foremost effigy a shove to send it toppling back, pulling free of the muck and thunking into another behind it. Then a third gave way, a slow chain reaction that disturbed the silt, but the worms not at all. Abruptly, his legs were yanked from beneath him and he was upside down again, moving up and away, something reeling him like a fish. He nearly panicked and lost the breath locked inside until the tug on his ankle made sense. Chemo being chemo again. He couldn't right himself under the tension, never enough slack to turn around. Rather than flail at the end of the rope, he relaxed and let it happen until he broke the surface, spewing bubbles and foam, and breathed with a violent gasp, once more a creature of land and air. Chemo peered down from the boat as if expecting to see him floating motionless. Must have set another personal best without even realizing. How long? Danny said. Normal. He had to act normal. 7 minutes. 7. Whoa. He would have never guessed. I had to pull the plug, and yet... You're fine. You sound disappointed about that. No, that's good. Chemo shook his head. Never again. Never again. You need to find somebody else to take you off for this, brother. All you do is scare the shit out of me. Poor Chemo. Danny felt genuinely bad for him. Bad for them both. Because it wouldn't have helped one bit to tell Chemo that no, he wasn't fine. He hadn't come up fine at all. Worse, he couldn't tell Gale either. How was he supposed to convey a thing like this? They're you. They're supposed to be you. He couldn't even be sure how she would react. If she'd find it flattering, the best thing since ambergris, or if the balance would tip and this weird synergy between her and the sea would finally leave her spooked. Once she picked up on the obvious, that something was bothering him, his only option was to lie. Had a bad dive, burst a blood vessel in my nose. It happens. All he could do was look ahead, try to get her away for 2 weeks, inject some time and distance to break this encroaching spell, and leave whatever carvings might wash up next for someone else to find. Why don't you come with me to Tahiti, for the billabong? It's been years. Well, I know, but I should stay. I don't have the kind of work I can take with me. She was hardly doing the work now. It'll still be here when you get back. You might even get some new ideas there to bring home. Like tiki carvings? I went through my tiki phase years ago. Oh, right. She had. He packed and planned and tried his best to make it sound enticing. Seeing the Pacific from another side would do them good. This could be the last time he went there as a competitor. None of it seemed to quite get through. I know. I just like it here. There's something about here. Some people go their whole lives looking for the place they should be. I found mine here. A long time ago. Even before she'd found him. Gail was too kind to say so, but it had to have crossed her mind. He was one more gift the sea had given her. The one thing it was most capable of taking back. That worried her. It had all along. I love you. You've always been my anchor, she would tell him. But it scares me what could happen if the anchor chain ever broke. In that way of sounds, unusual enough to penetrate, familiar enough to not alarm, it wove its way into his dreams before teasing him awake. The dream dissolved at once, so he lay in the dark with the only thing left, the far, reverberant squeal of a whale, rolling in across the water and floating up through the open window. Listen, he whispered, and reached over to give Gail a gentle shake. But her side of the bed was empty, a sure sign she was listening already. She wasn't at the window, wasn't in the kitchen, wasn't in the bathroom or front room. He knew the feel of a house emptied of any other heartbeat than his own. Danny yanked on enough clothing to call himself decent, a t-shirt and shorts that felt backwards, then stumbled outside. But she wasn't on the deck either. The night was as bright as nights got. All moon and no clouds, and the sea a glittering expanse of silver white and blue black. It was the world. It was their entire world. Braced against the redwood deck, he peered down at the beach. After a moment, his fingers gripped the rail with the same steadying ferocity as his toes gripped a surfboard. He felt every bit as much in motion, shooting through a rolling barrel that collapsed behind him. From up here, he was so accustomed to the sight of Neptune's throne that the high-backed platform was as familiar a fixture of the landscape as the ridge on which they lived. But now its shape was different. Wrong. He couldn't see what, exactly. Only that some hulking form occupied it. Bulbous and enormous. Wet enough and slick enough to catch the moonlight with an iridescent gleam. To his left, a form no bigger than a person traversed toward it, small and dark against the pale sands. He heard it again, rebounding from the cliffs, the same high, rolling squall that had brought him awake, the forlorn cry he'd always taken for a passing whale, roaming the endless waters and calling out for what or who might answer. Danny sprinted for the beach stairs, the zigzag flights up which he'd helped lug a lifetime's worth of the sea's gifts. Clueless, never imagining what it might have wanted or expected in return. Pounding down the steps, he was as good as blind, the moonlight trapped above the canopy of leaves that crowded up and over. Although he held the rail, heedless of the splinters he'd picked up along the way, he went tumbling before he knew what happened. Something damp and slick sliding beneath his bare foot. His leg torqued one way while the rest of him torqued another. If pain glowed, his knee would have lit the light. No wave had ever flung him more violently than this, than gravity and his own momentum. He juddered down the stairs, sometimes on his hip, sometimes on his rump. Every hardwood step another bruise. When he thudded to a stop, he had 2 flights left to go, and scooted the rest of the way on his ass. Down on the beach, he tried to stand, but his knee wasn't having it. He tumbled to the sand, still warm from the day's sun. He crawled, striving to see through the pink haze of pain, first making out the moon-etched lines of the cliffs ahead, and then below them, the suggestion of some lesser mountain that rose up and slouched back toward the sea. Then he crawled until he found a line of dimples in the sand, footprints, unbroken and resolute. He followed them, dragging his useless leg behind him, hearing nothing but the wheeze of his breath and the crash and retreat of the waves. He crawled into the pillars and planks of Neptune's throne loomed above him, empty now, but darkened with water and draped with robes of seaweed, the air around it rich with a heavy musk of brine. The sand before it was churned to wet clumps and crooked furrows, as if between here and the water's edge the beach had been plowed by some dragging thing, bristling with appendages that had tried to walk, but was never meant to move on land. Alongside the disturbance, the line of her steps turned, veering toward the water. He followed these 2, scrambling on both elbows and one good knee, until they were no longer dimples but true footprints, pressed into the wet sand, heel and arch and 5 small toes. He scurried ahead, frantic now, as step by step the prints began to change, the impression left by each toe deepening, as though dug by a hooked and spiny claw, with a growth of webbing in between. He followed them to the foaming lip of the sea, where he lost them, her last footprints, erased, as the water washed across and smoothed the sand blank again. Still, he floundered onward as the waves battered him head-on, stopping only when he was slapped across the face and shoulder by something solid, heavy as a wet blanket, that clung like a cowl. Sputtering, he peeled it away, and when after the longest moments of his life, he accepted what the tattered thing was. He had no idea what to do with it. He couldn't bring himself to pitch it away, couldn't think of any reason to keep holding on. If Gale didn't need her skin anymore, then where on land or sea was it supposed to go? Out past the breakers, beneath the moon, a gleaming, bulbous dome submerged with an elephantine skronk that he felt ripple through the waves and shudder through the sand. Then, he was alone. He knew the feel of a shore emptied of any other heartbeat than his own. He retreated far enough to keep from choking, then rolled onto his back to face the stars, exhausted and sweating from the pain. The water surged in and out for 1,000 cycles, and 1,000 more. In time, he wondered which of the ligaments in his knee were in shreds. ACL, PCL, LCL, MCL. Any and all. He surely had a motherfucker of a hamstring tear as well. Whatever the damage, his career was done, even sooner than expected. By the time Danny was ready to move again, the sky had lightened to a formless gray. Fog had crept in across the waters, and with it, a stinging drizzle of rain. His knee was swollen double, and he couldn't bend his leg, but nothing much hurt by default anymore. There was dawn enough for him to spy a familiar shape stranded in the channels, where the sea met the freshwater stream from the cliffs. He made for it, mocking thing that it was, as complete a carving as he'd seen, even farther along than the one sunk amid the kelp beds. Or maybe this was one of them, finished along the way. He knew its shape, knew the face, the hands folded as if in prayer, but he knew nothing of the depicted changes wrought upon the rest of her, the thin, frilled slits at either side of her throat, the fins along each forearm and lower leg. But he did know, and had all along, that she'd smelled of the sea, and tasted of it too, and that the ocean and its gods recognized their own. Gale must have known as well, somewhere inside. Must have cherished the sea even while living in fear that if she ever went out on it, she might not come back. It would never stop wanting her. He had to admit that this carving, all of them, appeared to have been made with love. But love, as Gale had said, on a whole different wavelength. He rolled the effigy back out into the surf, fighting the wishes of the waves, the most grueling task he'd ever done. But it was still a log at heart. It floated. The first 20 yards from shore were the hardest, the next 100 a little easier. He clung to this new gale until he could no longer push off the sandy bottom, then threw his good leg over and across, straddling it like a surfboard, and paddling out to sea. In time, the roar of the breakers faded behind him, until he was left with the quieter slop and splash of a calmer sea, as the dim sun rose over his shoulders and began to burn the fog away. He paddled as far as he could, until he thought he might have just 5 more good, strong minutes left inside. The ocean yawned deep and dark beneath. He could still breathe, but with one leg, could he kick hard enough to overcome the air in his lungs? Could he reach that threshold that changed everything? He had to believe he could. 40 feet. He only had to make it another 40 feet. 2 days ago, he'd spent 7 minutes under, and it went like nothing. There had to be meaning in that. Superhumans were popping up everywhere, remember? Something in the air, something in the water. A beautiful time to be alive. He rolled off the log and made the plunge. He would find Gale again, or he wouldn't. He too was ready for another way of life, or he wasn't. The ocean would accept him, or it wouldn't. But he could still be a part of it. Either way.
Chilling tales for dark nights.